There is a stretch of ocean that most people will never see, and fewer still could find on a map without hesitation. It sits between the western coast of France and the northern shore of Spain, a roughly 500-kilometer-wide body of cold, grey, restless water connecting the English Channel to the open North Atlantic. It has no glamour, it has no famous beaches, it does not call to mind the great set pieces of the Second World War the way Normandy does, or Stalingrad, or El Alamein. Most histories of the war pass over it in a paragraph, if they pause there at all. And yet more men died in those grey waters, and above them, than most people will ever know. The Bay of Biscay was not a battlefield in any conventional sense. There were no front lines drawn on it. No flags were planted on its surface. Armies did not march across it. What happened there was something quieter, more patient, and in many ways more desperate than the great land campaigns that fill the history books. A 5-year duel fought between aircraft that could barely find their targets and submarines that could barely see the sky, between men in machines that were either too exposed or too confined, between scientists in back rooms and engineers on factory floors racing to outwit each other before the next convoy sailed and the next crew was lost. This is the story of that duel. It begins in the summer of 1940, when France fell and the shape of the entire war at sea changed overnight. The German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, had spent years operating from ports in northern Germany, their submarines forced to make long, exhausting surface voyages around the British Isles before they could even reach the hunting grounds of the Atlantic. Then, in a matter of weeks, everything changed. The French Atlantic coast fell into German hands, and with it came a chain of deep-water ports, Brest, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, La Pallice, Bordeaux, sitting right on the Bay of Biscay, perfectly positioned for a submarine force whose entire purpose was to strangle Britain's supply lines across the ocean. Transit times collapsed. What had once taken weeks now took days. U-boats could reach the convoy routes faster, stay longer, and return sooner. For the men commanding Britain's war effort, the implications were almost too large to absorb. Every ton of food, every barrel of fuel, every rifle and tank and aircraft that kept Britain fighting arrived by sea. The convoys crossing the North Atlantic were not simply a logistical concern. They were the pulse of the entire Allied war effort, and the Bay of Biscay was now the artery through which the knife was being drawn. Admiral Karl Dönitz understood this with absolute clarity. The U-boat arm he commanded was a weapon he had been refining for years, training his crews to a standard that bordered on obsessive, organizing them into the wolf-pack formations that would become one of the most feared tactical innovations of the war. In the early years, his men were confident to a degree that, in hindsight, looks almost heartbreaking. They called the early period of the war the happy time. Hunting was easy, kills were frequent, the Atlantic seemed open and undefended, and the Bay of Biscay was simply the road they drove down to reach it. But on the other side of that grey water, something was also taking shape. RAF Coastal Command, chronically underfunded, perpetually overlooked, handed the aircraft that other commands did not want, began to learn. Slowly, painfully, expensively, they began to learn how to fight in a medium that had no precedent, tracking invisible enemies through thousands of cubic kilometers of ocean and sky. They made mistakes that cost lives. They used weapons that did not work, flew aircraft that could not reach far enough, and spent months patrolling empty water while the submarines passed beneath them unseen. But they kept going. And in that persistence, combined with a sequence of technological breakthroughs that would reshape naval warfare permanently, lay the seeds of something Dönitz never fully anticipated, a campaign that would turn the Bay of Biscay from a highway into a gauntlet. What followed was 5 years of invention, adaptation, loss, and hard-won advantage. Radar appeared, and the night transit was suddenly dangerous. The Germans built a warning receiver, and safety returned. Centimetric radar appeared, and the warning receiver went blind. Acoustic torpedoes threatened the escorts. Decoys countered them. Schnorkels hid the submarines from the sky. And beneath all of it, men died. British and Commonwealth airmen spinning into the sea after being hit by anti-aircraft fire. German submariners sealed in boats that never surfaced again. Merchant sailors in cold water, waiting for rescue that sometimes never came. This documentary is the full story of that campaign, every chapter of it, from the fall of France to the fall of the Biscay ports themselves, from the first tentative patrols of 1940 to the final departures of the last German submarines from bases that had housed them for 4 years. We cover the technology and the tactics, the commanders and the crews, the strategic turning points, and the small human moments that history tends to smooth over in its rush toward conclusion. We are going to take our time with it. That is the whole point. If you are watching this to sleep, or to drift, or simply to spend a few hours in the company of a story that deserves more attention than it has usually received, then you have found the right place. Get comfortable. Let the grey water and the grey sky settle around you. This is a long film, built for long nights, and there is no part of it you need to rush. If this is your first time finding this channel, the best thing you can do right now is subscribe and turn on notifications, because this is what we do here. Full, unabridged, sleep-friendly documentaries on the battles and campaigns that shaped the modern world, told with the patience and the depth they deserve. There are no shortcuts here, no 3-minute summaries, just the whole story, told properly, from beginning to end. The Bay of Biscay campaign is, in many ways, the hidden war inside the hidden war. While the grand narrative of the Second World War moved through North Africa and Sicily, and eventually onto the beaches of Normandy, out in that grey and largely unwatched stretch of ocean, something quieter and more consequential was being decided. The ability of Britain to survive, the ability of the United States to project power across the Atlantic, the ability of the entire Allied coalition to sustain itself long enough to win. It was decided by airmen who flew 12-hour patrols over featureless water and came home with nothing to show for it. It was decided by submariners who crossed that same water in both directions, knowing that the odds against them were growing with every month that passed. It was decided in laboratories and operational research offices by people whose names appear in almost no popular account of the war, and it was decided, ultimately, by the slow accumulation of technological and tactical advantage, won and lost and won again, over 5 relentless years. That story begins now. There is a body of water that most people have never thought about, and fewer still could point to on a map without hesitation. It lies between the western coast of France and the northern tip of Spain, open to the full fury of the North Atlantic on its western edge, sheltered by nothing, softened by nothing. Sailors have feared it for centuries, not because of what hides beneath it, but simply because of what it is. A wide, restless, storm-tormented expanse, where the ocean does whatever it pleases, and no coastline offers comfort in time. Its name is the Bay of Biscay, and for most of recorded history, it was known primarily as a graveyard for the careless and a trial for the brave. But between 1940 and 1944, it became something else entirely. It became the central artery of a secret war, a war fought in grey skies and grey water, between men who rarely saw each other's faces and almost never survived each other's weapons. It became the choke point on which the outcome of the Second World War quietly, invisibly, and irrevocably turned. To understand why that body of water mattered so profoundly, you have to begin with a simpler fact. Britain is an island. It always has been, and in 1940, that geographic truth carried with it an almost unbearable weight. Everything the country needed to fight and to survive, food, fuel, steel, ammunition, machinery, men, had to arrive by sea. The North Atlantic was not merely a trade route in that year, it was a lifeline in the most literal sense of the word. the vein through which blood continued to flow to a nation that had been left standing largely alone after the fall of France. Across that ocean, convoys of merchant ships, slow, heavily laden, desperately vulnerable, made the crossing from North America in columns that stretched for miles. They carried everything. Without them, Britain would have been forced to its knees within months, not years. Every German strategist understood this, and one in particular had built his entire career around exploiting it. Admiral Karl Dönitz had understood the mathematics of tonnage warfare long before the war began. His doctrine was not complicated, though its execution would demand extraordinary skill, sink Allied merchant ships faster than they could be replaced or repaired, and Britain's capacity to wage war would collapse under the weight of its own losses. The weapon he intended to use was the submarine, the U-boat, and for years before the shooting started, he had been constructing both the boats and the men who would crew them, shaping a force of exceptional professionalism and ruthless operational focus. What Dönitz lacked in the early years of the war was proximity. His boats operated out of German ports on the North Sea coast, which meant that before a U-boat commander could reach the North Atlantic hunting grounds, he had to complete a long and exhausting transit northward around the British Isles, consuming fuel, time, and the physical reserves of his crew before the actual work had even begun. The Bay of Biscay, in those early months of conflict, was irrelevant to him. It was simply a stretch of water he could not use. Then France fell. In the summer of 1940, in a collapse so rapid and complete that it stunned even the Germans who executed it, France surrendered to the Third Reich. The consequences of that defeat rippled outward in every direction, reshaping the strategic map of the war in ways that would take years to fully comprehend. For Dönitz, one consequence stood above all others: the French Atlantic coast, with its deep water ports and its direct access to the open ocean, was now in German hands. 5 ports in particular changed everything: Brest and Lorient in the north of Brittany, Saint-Nazaire further south, La Pallice near La Rochelle, and Bordeaux deep in the Gironde estuary. These were not small harbours. They were substantial naval installations, capable of receiving, servicing, rearming, and replenishing ocean-going submarines. And they sat on the edge of the Bay of Biscay, looking westward into the Atlantic. The arithmetic of what this meant was brutal and immediate. A U-boat operating from Kiel or Wilhelmshaven on the German coast had to travel roughly 4,500 kilometers to reach the convoy routes of the mid-Atlantic. From Lorient, that same journey was reduced to perhaps half that distance, the exact figure varying by route and destination, but the saving in time and fuel was staggering regardless. Where a boat might previously have spent the better part of its operational patrol simply getting to and from the hunting ground, it could now arrive faster, remain longer, and return more quickly for replenishment and redeployment. In operational terms, it was as if Dönitz had been handed twice as many submarines without building a single additional hull. For the crews, the new ports meant shorter transits and more time on station. For Allied shipping, it meant the wolves were now kennelled much closer to the flock. The Germans moved quickly. Construction teams began work on hardened submarine pens at the French Atlantic ports within weeks of the armistice, pouring millions of tons of concrete into structures of almost medieval solidity, bunkers designed to shelter the boats from any aerial bombardment the British might attempt. They were right to build them. By the time Allied bombers eventually turned their attention to the Biscay ports, the pens were so thick that no bomb then available could penetrate them. The bases were, for all practical purposes, indestructible from the air. What the Allies could not destroy in port, they would have to destroy at sea, and the only sea between those ports and the Atlantic was the Bay of Biscay. That geographic fact, more than any other single factor, defined the character of the campaign that followed. For Britain, the fall of France and the loss of any French naval cooperation was a wound that ran deep into the strategic body of the war at sea. The Royal Navy, already stretched across multiple theatres and commitments, now faced a resurgent U-boat offensive, operating from bases that shortened every attack and complicated every defense. The convoy system, the organization of merchant ships into protected groups, was the primary tool for managing the threat, but it was a tool with limitations. Convoys could be routed, escorted, and supported, but they could not simply be hidden in an ocean that U-boats were now patrolling in growing numbers and with growing confidence. The crisis was real, and it was sharpening with every passing month of the war's second year. What made the Bay of Biscay the natural focus of Allied counter-effort was precisely this. Every single U-boat that left a French Atlantic port to hunt in the North Atlantic had to cross it. There was no alternative route, no shortcut, no way around it. The bay was roughly 400 kilometers wide at its broadest, and a surfaced submarine crossing at its best transit speed would spend several days in its waters, exposed to whatever the Allies could bring to bear. If that crossing could be made dangerous enough, costly enough in boats and crews, then Dönitz's entire offensive would be degraded at its source, before the wolf packs could even form. The bay was not just a transit route, it was a potential trap, a bottleneck that worked in both directions. It had given the Germans their strategic gift in 1940. The question was whether the Allies could turn it back into a liability. The RAF's Coastal Command was the organization nominally responsible for covering that water. In 1940, it was a command that existed more in title than in capability, under-resourced, under-prioritized, equipped with aircraft of limited range and sensors of limited effectiveness, operating over an area of ocean so vast that meaningful coverage was essentially impossible with the assets available. Its crews were determined, often extraordinarily so, but determination is not a substitute for range or weapons that work. The early patrols over the bay in 1940 and 1941 were honest efforts that produced almost nothing, and the U-boats moved through those grey waters with a freedom that was, from any Allied perspective, deeply alarming. The merchant seamen who crossed the Atlantic in those years understood the stakes more viscerally than any planner behind a desk in London. For them, the ocean was not an abstraction. It was the cold, dark water that might swallow them at any moment, with a torpedo strike that gave almost no warning and offered almost no chance of rescue. The Bay of Biscay was far from where the torpedoes flew, but it was the place where the machinery of their destruction was being assembled and dispatched. Every U-boat that cleared the bay and reached the Atlantic shipping lanes represented a decision, somewhere in the long chain of Allied failure, to let that happen. The men who sailed the convoys were paying for those failures in the most direct currency imaginable. It would take years, immense sacrifice, and a sustained campaign of technological and tactical innovation before the bay would be transformed from a highway into a killing ground. The story of how that transformation happened is not a clean or triumphant one. It is full of setbacks, dead ends, lost aircraft, and drowned men on both sides. It is a story about institutions learning slowly under the pressure of catastrophe, about scientists and engineers whose work mattered as much as any act of physical courage, and about ordinary men on both sides of the water, placed in situations of extreme and sustained danger for months and years on end. The Bay of Biscay did not make headlines the way great land battles did. It did not produce a single decisive engagement that history could point to as the moment everything changed. What it produced instead was a grinding, attritional, technically complex campaign whose outcome was built from thousands of small decisions, discoveries, and acts of perseverance that accumulated, over time, into something that decided the war. That campaign begins here, in 1940, with the smell of fresh concrete in the Lorient pens and the sound of diesel engines turning over in the dark as the first U-boats set course for the open water and the long hunt begins. He was not a man who spoke in abstractions. Karl Dönitz had served beneath the waves in the First World War, had been captured, had endured the humiliation of defeat, and had come away from all of it with a single, organizing conviction. The submarine was not a weapon of opportunity. it was a weapon of system. When he was given command of the rebuilding German U-boat arm in the mid-1930s, he set about constructing that system with the methodical patience of someone who believed, with total certainty, that he had already worked out the mathematics of Britain's destruction. The tonnage of merchant shipping keeping the island nation alive was calculable. The rate at which submarines could sink that tonnage was calculable. The conclusion, to Dönitz, was therefore inevitable, provided he was given enough boats and the freedom to use them correctly. He would spend the entire war arguing he was given neither in sufficient measure, and he was not entirely wrong. The doctrine he developed was called Rudeltaktik, wolf pack tactics, and it was built around a fundamental insight into convoy warfare. A single submarine attacking a convoy was a manageable problem. A convoy's escorts could localize it, hunt it, and either sink it or drive it deep until the convoy had passed. But a coordinated group of submarines attacking simultaneously from multiple bearings overwhelmed any escort screen, forced defenders to make impossible choices, and allowed individual boats to press home attacks while the escorts were occupied with their neighbors. Dönitz directed his wolf packs through a centralized system, receiving radio reports from boats at sea, building a picture of Allied convoy movements at his headquarters, and then broadcasting attack orders that coordinated strikes across hundreds of miles of ocean. It was a form of command and control warfare that felt, to those inside it, almost industrial in its logic, and almost impossible to survive, to those on the receiving end of it. The machines at the center of this system were the Type 7 and the Type 9 submarines, and between them, they covered almost every demand the war in the Atlantic would make. The Type 7 was the workhorse, compact, maneuverable, and built in greater numbers than any other German submarine design of the war. At roughly 220 tons surface displacement in its most common variant, it was not a large vessel. Its pressure hull held a crew of somewhere between 44 and 52 men in conditions that bordered on the medieval. There was one toilet for the entire crew, which doubled as a storage locker for provisions in the early weeks of a patrol. Torpedoes rested in their tubes and on the floor of the forward compartment, and men slept on and around them, on rotating bunks, in a practice called hot bunking, one man leaving a bunk still warm for the next. The smell of a Type 7 submarine on a long patrol, diesel oil, mold, unwashed bodies, and the chemical traces of the boat's own atmosphere, was described by virtually everyone who experienced it as something that had to be lived through rather than explained. The Type 9 was a larger, longer-range design, better suited to operations in more distant waters, the South Atlantic, the Caribbean, the coast of North America, where the Type 7 might carry 14 torpedoes and range as far as 8,000 nautical miles. The Type 9 extended both figures considerably, allowing patrols of extraordinary duration that took boats far beyond the Bay of Biscay and into waters the Allied convoy system had not yet learned to defend. Both designs shared the same essential vulnerability. They were not true submarines in the modern sense, but submersibles, vessels that spent most of their operational lives on the surface, diving only to attack or to escape. Underwater, they were slow, and their battery endurance was finite. The ocean surface was where they breathed, where they ran at full speed, and where they were increasingly exposed to what was coming. Training a man to live and fight inside these machines was itself a form of war. The process began months before any boat saw an operational patrol, weeks at shore establishments, then Baltic training exercises in waters that were tactically demanding but geographically enclosed. Crews drilled emergency dives until the sequence of actions was reflexive, until every man knew his station and his task without needing to think about it, because in a real emergency, there would be no time to think. They practiced torpedo attacks, surface navigation, damage control, and the controlled management of fear, because fear, inside a pressure hull at depth, with the sound of propellers overhead and the concussion of depth charges transmitted through the hull plates like hammer blows against the body, was the one constant that training could moderate but never fully remove. The men who emerged from this process were, by any measure, highly capable, and in the early years of the war, they knew it. The first happy time ran roughly from the middle of 1940 to the end of 1941, and for the men who lived through it, the phrase captured something real. Allied anti-submarine capability in those months was genuinely inadequate. Convoy escorts were few, their detection equipment was primitive, and the tactical coordination between air and sea forces that would eventually defeat the U-boat arm simply did not yet exist. Boats went out, found convoys, attacked, and returned with tonnage figures that seemed almost embarrassingly large. Commanders came back to Lorient, the principal U-boat base on the Biscay coast, to be met by Dönitz personally, decorated at dockside ceremonies, celebrated in German newsreels as the Iron Wolves of the Deep, avatars of a new and irresistible form of naval warfare. The culture that developed inside the U-boat arm during these months was not merely confident, it had an edge of genuine contempt for the enemy's ability to stop what was happening. Individual commanders became famous within the arm and beyond it. Their names circulated in the mess halls and the briefing rooms, their tonnage totals tracked like sporting scores, their tactical innovations studied and imitated. There was a competitive spirit that Dönitz, himself a former frontline commander, understood and deliberately cultivated, because competition produced aggression, and aggression produced sinkings. He built a command culture that rewarded initiative and pushed commanders to press their attacks further than caution would have recommended, and in those first years, caution did not seem to be paying any dividends for the enemy anyway. The Bay of Biscay in 1940 and 1941 was still simply a stretch of water to be crossed, grey, cold, and storm-prone, but not yet lethal. It was a transit route, nothing more. The danger lay at the convoy lanes, not in the approach. But beneath the confidence, the conditions were already extracting a cost that decorations and newsreel footage could not fully offset. A typical war patrol lasted several weeks, and in that time the interior of a Type 7 became something that civilians ashore could barely imagine. Condensation dripped from every surface. Mold grew on bread within days of leaving port. Fresh food lasted perhaps a week, after which the crew lived on tinned provisions and whatever else the space constraints of the boat had allowed. Sleep was rationed and partial. Men on watch for hours at a stretch, then sleeping in whatever bunk or corner the boat's cramped geometry permitted. The noise of the diesel engines at full surface speed was near constant and physically wearing. When the boat dove, the change to electric motors brought a relative quiet that many crews described as psychologically unsettling in its own way. The silence of concealment, the silence of a vessel waiting to be found. The men who served in these conditions were, on average, young. Aboard a typical Type 7, the crew might include a significant proportion of men in their late teens and early 20s, many of them making their first real patrol. Officers were older by a matter of degrees rather than decades. A commander might be in his mid to late 20s, carrying the lives of 40 or 50 men inside a steel tube beneath the North Atlantic, making decisions in seconds that would determine whether all of them came home. The psychological weight of that responsibility, accumulated across multiple patrols, across months and then years of war, shaped men in ways that were difficult to articulate from the outside. Some grew harder and more certain, some simply endured. A smaller number broke quietly, in ways that their crewmates recognized but rarely spoke about directly. What held the arm together, beyond training and doctrine, and the particular magnetism of Dönitz's personal leadership, was something more elemental. The U-boat crews were a self-selected group in the sense that service was technically voluntary. Men had to apply for the submarine arm rather than being assigned to it, and this created a shared identity that sustained cohesion even as conditions worsened. They thought of themselves as different from the surface navy, from the army, from the Luftwaffe, as a separate tribe with its own codes and its own understanding of what the war required of them. That identity would be tested in the months and years ahead, in ways that none of them, in the celebratory atmosphere of the happy time, could yet fully imagine. The bay that lay between their French ports and the open Atlantic was still just geography. It had not yet become a killing ground. That transformation was coming, and when it came, it would be slow, grinding, and absolute. Dönitz had promised his crews results if they were used correctly. He had constructed the doctrine, the training system, and the command culture to deliver those results. In the early years, the results had come. What he could not fully control was the other side of the equation, the adversary who was watching, measuring, learning, and building, in those same grey months, the tools and the institutions that would eventually be turned against everything the U-boat arm had built. The Bay of Biscay would become the ground on which that reversal was decided. But in 1940 and 1941, it was still the beginning, and the iron wolves were still running. There is a particular kind of institutional loneliness that belongs to organizations asked to fight a war they were never properly equipped to fight. RAF Coastal Command knew that loneliness intimately. Born from the old Coastal Area Command of the Royal Air Force, it had existed since 1936 as a formation whose purpose, maritime patrol, anti-submarine work, the grinding watch over empty ocean, failed to excite the imaginations of the men who controlled budgets and allocated aircraft. The Air Ministry looked toward Bomber Command with something close to reverence. Coastal Command, by contrast, was regarded in some quarters as a necessary inconvenience. When war came in September of 1939, and the U-boats began their work almost immediately, Coastal Command found itself responsible for a vast and critical mission with aircraft that were too few, too slow, too short in range, and too lightly armed to carry it out properly. It was, in the bluntest possible assessment, an organization being asked to win a battle with the wrong tools, the wrong priority, and the wrong reputation. The command's area of responsibility was almost incomprehensibly large. To fly out across the Bay of Biscay from airfields in southwest England and Cornwall was to enter a world without landmarks, without reference points, and without the certainty of return. The bay itself stretches roughly 500 kilometers from north to south, and roughly 400 kilometers from east to west, at its widest point. An aircraft of 1940 had no guarantee of finding a target in that grey immensity, no certainty of navigating back accurately, and no margin for mechanical failure over water so cold and so remote from rescue. The crews who flew these early patrols were not cowards, quite the opposite, but they were sent out on missions where the probability of achieving anything decisive was deeply, structurally low. Hours would pass over featureless ocean. The eye would strain against cloud and whitecap. The radio altimeter would give its readings in indifferent numbers, and then the aircraft would turn for home, having seen nothing, having achieved nothing, carrying back nothing but fuel exhaustion and the accumulated weight of a fruitless watch. The aircraft available to Coastal Command in the early years of the campaign were genuinely inadequate for the work demanded of them. The Avro Anson, affectionate called Faithful Annie by the crews who flew her, was a dependable and forgiving machine, but she lacked the range to reach more than the near margins of the bay, and she carried a bomb load modest enough to make any U-boat commander feel relatively safe. The short Sunderland flying boat was a more formidable machine, with genuine ocean range and a crew large enough to sustain long patrols, but there were never enough of them. The Lockheed Hudson, arriving from American manufacturers, offered improvements but still fell short of what the Bay campaign truly required. What was needed was a long-range aircraft capable of flying out to the middle of the bay, lingering there for hours, and still having the fuel to return, a requirement that would not be adequately met until considerably later in the war, when consolidated liberators began arriving in meaningful numbers. In the meantime, Coastal Command flew what it had, and what it had was rarely enough. The weapons available were equally problematic. The standard anti-submarine weapon of the early war period was the aerial depth charge, a cylindrical device designed to detonate at a set depth beneath the surface and damage a submarine's hull through water pressure. In theory, this was a sound concept. In practice, the execution was deeply flawed. The settings used for depth detonation were typically far too deep, calibrated on assumptions about submarine diving behavior that would prove consistently optimistic. An aircraft that actually found a U-boat and managed to attack it was, more often than not, dropping weapons that would explode harmlessly far below the submarine's actual position at the moment of attack. Crews would make their runs with genuine courage, pull away with genuine hope, and watch the water erupt with satisfying violence, only to see the U-boat emerge undamaged and begin its dive undisturbed. The knowledge that the weapons simply did not work as required was one of the quiet, corrosive, demoralizing facts of Coastal Command life in those early years. It would be wrong to suggest that the command was entirely without effect during this period. The mere presence of aircraft over the bay imposed a psychological and tactical cost on U-boat crews, forcing them to remain alert, to keep watches, to dive more often than they otherwise might, and to expend time and energy on defensive measures that subtracted from their offensive capacity. A U-boat that dived because it spotted an aircraft was a U-boat that was not making speed toward the Atlantic hunting grounds. A crew worn down by constant surfacing and diving was a crew whose combat effectiveness was marginally reduced. These were real effects, even if they did not translate into the kind of definitive sinkings that made headlines. But in the brutal arithmetic of the Bay campaign, where the primary objective was destroying submarines rather than merely inconveniencing them, these marginal effects fell far short of what the strategic situation demanded. The institutional struggle inside the British command structure during this period was fierce and occasionally bitter. Coastal Command existed in an uncomfortable position between the Air Ministry, which regarded maritime patrol work as less important than strategic bombing, and the Admiralty, which had its own ideas about how air assets should be used, and often felt that control of anti-submarine aviation should rest with the Navy rather than the Air Force. Resources were argued over, allocated, withdrawn, and argued over again. An officer attempting to secure more Liberators or Sunderlands for bay patrols found himself competing not merely against German ingenuity, but against the formidable bureaucratic gravity of Bomber Command's requirements. Arthur Harris, who would later command Bomber Command with absolute conviction that strategic bombing would win the war, was not inclined to divert heavy aircraft toward what he regarded as an essentially defensive role over grey water. The tension between these competing visions of how air power should be used would continue well beyond these early years, never entirely resolved, always quietly costing the Bay campaign in resources it could not afford to lose. Within Coastal Command itself, and within the broader anti-submarine community, there were officers who understood clearly what needed to be done and spent these early frustrating years building the intellectual and institutional foundations for the offensive that would eventually come. The argument being constructed, quietly and persistently, was not merely that U-boats should be attacked when encountered. That was obvious. The deeper argument was that the Bay of Biscay, as a transit corridor through which every U-boat operating from French Atlantic ports was compelled to pass, represented a strategic choke point of extraordinary value. If the bay could be made consistently, reliably dangerous, if the transit could be transformed from a relatively safe passage into a genuine gauntlet, then the entire geometry of the Atlantic campaign would shift. U-boats would be arriving in the hunting grounds already damaged, already short of fuel, already crewed by men worn down by days of harassment. Some would never arrive at all. The bay was not merely a body of water, it was a potential trap, and the argument was about how to close it. The men making this argument were not yet winning it. The resources did not yet exist. The technology was not yet ready, and the institutional resistance was not yet overcome. But the argument itself was of immense importance, because it meant that when the resources did arrive, when the technology did mature, there would already be a doctrine waiting to deploy them. Some of the most important work of 1940 and 1941 was not done by aircrew over grey water, though those men were doing something real and necessary. It was done in offices and conference rooms, and in the margins of operational research reports. by officers and scientists who were looking at the Bay campaign with a cold and systematic eye and beginning to understand what winning it would actually require. Among those paying close attention to the emerging possibilities was the scientist Patrick Blackett, whose work in operational research was already beginning to change the analytical vocabulary of the British military. Blackett and his colleagues were applying rigorous statistical methods to questions that had previously been answered by instinct and tradition. How many aircraft were needed to make a patrol line genuinely effective? What depth setting on a depth charge actually maximized the probability of a lethal detonation? What patrol geometry covered the most ocean with the fewest aircraft? These were not glamorous questions, but they were the right ones, and the answers that emerged from that work would eventually reshape Coastal Command's entire approach to the Bay. The contribution of operational research to the eventual victory in the Bay campaign is one of the less celebrated chapters of the war's intellectual history, but it is a genuine one. The early patrols continued, month after month through 1940 and 1941, their tedium punctuated by the occasional contact that more often than not resolved into nothing: a shadow, a wave pattern, a false reading on an unreliable instrument. The crews who flew them deserve recognition not for dramatic success, because dramatic success was largely unavailable to them, but for the professionalism and persistence with which they flew missions that were structurally unlikely to achieve their stated objectives. They were collecting experience, building navigation techniques, learning the particular demands of long ocean flying in a way that would matter enormously when the equipment finally improved. Every fruitless patrol was also a training flight, an accumulation of institutional knowledge about how the Bay behaved, how weather moved across it, how U-boats tended to position themselves relative to the coast and the shipping lanes. The German submariners transiting the Bay during this period were aware of the aircraft above them and broadly unafraid of them. The threat was real but manageable: a keen lookout, a quick dive, and the danger passed. The grey expanse of the Bay felt, in those early years, more like a corridor of relative safety than a killing ground. The crews of the U-boat arm were still riding the confidence of early successes, still crossing toward the Atlantic with something close to anticipation. They did not know, could not have known, that the unremarkable, frustrating, under-resourced command watching them from above was in the slow process of becoming something far more lethal. The institutional transformation of Coastal Command was happening at a pace invisible to those it would eventually consume. The hunters were still learning their craft. The prey had not yet learned to be afraid. For the first 2 years of the war, darkness was a gift. U-boat commanders had learned quickly that the skies above the Bay of Biscay were dangerous in daylight. Coastal Command aircraft, however limited in number and however unreliable their weapons, could at least see what they were hunting, and so the U-boats adjusted, as they always did. Commanders began timing their Bay transits to run the most exposed stretches of open water after sunset, slipping across the surface under cover of night, with a confidence that felt, for a time, entirely justified. The logic was simple, and the results seemed to confirm it. An aircraft that could not see a submarine could not attack one. For the men threading their boats through the grey Atlantic darkness toward the hunting grounds of the North Atlantic, nightfall felt like armor. It was a reasonable assumption, and it was about to be dismantled. The technology that would strip away that armor had been under development in British laboratories for several years before the war began, born from the same scientific urgency that was reshaping every dimension of the conflict. Air-to-surface vessel radar, known by its operational designation ASV Mark II, was a system fitted to aircraft that could detect objects on the surface of the sea by bouncing radio waves off them and measuring the returning echo. In theory, it could find a surfaced submarine regardless of visibility, regardless of cloud cover, regardless of whether the sun had set 3 minutes or 3 hours ago. In practice, the early versions were temperamental, poorly understood by aircrew who had received little training in their operation, and prone to producing cluttered returns that required considerable skill to interpret. But the principle was sound. and in the hands of crews who were beginning to learn how to read its signals, ASV Mark II represented something genuinely new: the ability to hunt in the dark. Coastal Command began fitting ASV Mark II to its patrol aircraft in meaningful numbers through 1941, and the first contacts in the Bay of Biscay established that the system worked well enough to transform the geometry of the hunt. A Wellington or a Whitley, flying an assigned patrol line on a moonless night, could now sweep a corridor of ocean and receive a blip on the radar screen, where before there had been nothing but blackness and noise. The radar operator's job demanded patience cards and a particular kind of attention: the ability to distinguish a genuine contact from the surface clutter of waves, to read the drift and strength of an echo and make a confident call to the pilot before the moment of potential attack dissolved into the darkness behind them. It was painstaking, unglamorous work, conducted in a cramped and freezing fuselage over an invisible ocean, and the men who became expert at it were rarely celebrated outside the squadrons they served in. But their skill was the foundation on which the entire night offensive rested. For U-boat crews, the first awareness that the night was no longer safe came through a disturbing chain of encounters that were difficult to explain away. Boats that should have been invisible were being caught on the surface at hours when no attack had seemed possible. The approach would come in darkness, sometimes with almost no warning: a sudden roar of engines overhead, the blast of a close explosion, a depth charge pattern that had been aimed not by sight, but by something else entirely. Survivors' accounts, when they could be gathered, described the same bewildering sequence: running submerged during the day, surfacing after dark with every reason to feel secure, and then finding the sky suddenly full of an enemy that had no business being there. The tactical adjustment that followed was predictable. If aircraft could now find U-boats in darkness, then the surface runs through the bay needed to be compressed, faster, perhaps broken into shorter windows. But the bay was wide, and the transit could not simply be compressed out of danger by willpower alone. What the radar gave the aircraft was a vector, a direction, and a rough distance. What it could not do, by itself, was illuminate the final moments of an attack. As a contact was run down, the radar return would become confused by proximity, and the aircraft would be flying nearly blind in the last crucial seconds before weapon release, guessing at the submarine's position, and often missing by margins that let the boat crash dive and survive. The radar was transforming the hunt, but the kill remained frustratingly elusive. RAF Coastal Command needed something that could bridge the gap between detection and destruction, something that could turn a radar vector into a confirmed visual in the final seconds of an attack run, giving the aircrew the targeting precision that darkness had previously denied them. The answer came from a man who had been thinking about exactly this problem for some time, and it was a solution of almost brutal simplicity. Wing Commander Humphrey DeVerd Lee had been working on the concept of an airborne searchlight since the early part of the war, convinced that the combination of radar detection and visual illumination was the key to cracking the night transit problem. What he proposed was a powerful retractable searchlight fitted into the underside of a patrol aircraft, ideally a Wellington, that could be switched on in the final seconds of a radar-directed attack run, flooding the target area with intense light at the precise moment the crew needed to see. The idea faced considerable institutional resistance. The Air Ministry was skeptical, some senior officers considered it impractical, and procurement decisions moved with the particular slowness of large organizations being asked to embrace an unfamiliar concept. But Lee pursued it with persistence. The logic was too compelling to ignore indefinitely, and eventually the trials began. When they did, the results were not ambiguous. The Lee Light, as it came to be called, was a searchlight of considerable power, capable of illuminating a surface target from an aircraft approaching at low altitude in complete darkness. The operational sequence it enabled was a tactical revolution. A Wellington fitted with ASV Mark II radar would detect a surfaced U-boat at range and begin a run-in, guided entirely by the radar operator's readings. The pilot would fly the approach on instruments, adjusting heading and altitude as the radar contact sharpened and the distance closed. Then, in the final moments before the estimated position of the target, the lee light would snap on, and suddenly, impossibly, a submarine would appear in the white glare below, the crew perhaps only now realizing what was descending toward them. The depth charges would follow within seconds. The entire sequence, from the moment of illumination to weapon release, left almost no time to react. For U-boat crews charging their batteries on a dark Atlantic night, it was a transformation from invisible safety to catastrophic exposure in the span of heartbeats. The first operational use of the lee light in the Bay of Biscay came in the summer of 1942, and the results were immediate enough to confirm every argument Lee had made. U-boats were caught on the surface, illuminated at close range, and attacked before their crews could reach the conning tower hatch, let alone complete a crash dive. The shock within the U-boat arm was considerable. Commanders who had built their transit routines entirely around the assumption of nocturnal safety now found themselves facing a threat that operated specifically and deliberately in the hours they had believed were their own. Dönitz received reports of boats attacked in darkness by aircraft that seemed to appear from nowhere, and the implications were deeply unsettling for a force whose survival depended on the surface for battery charging and high-speed movement. The gift of darkness was dissolving. The cat-and-mouse dynamic that defined the Bay campaign as a whole now entered one of its first clearly defined cycles. U-boat crews, facing attacks they could not predict or counter, began spending more of their transit time submerged, which solved the immediate problem of surface vulnerability, but created a different and equally serious one. A submarine running submerged in the bay was drawing down its battery reserves, limiting its speed, and constraining the hours it could dedicate to the actual work of hunting convoys once it reached the North Atlantic. Every hour spent deep in the bay to avoid lee light Wellingtons was an hour of operational capacity eroded before the mission had properly begun. Dönitz understood the mathematics of this as well as anyone, and he understood that his boats were being forced into a strategic dilemma: surface and risk attack, or submerge and arrive diminished. There was no comfortable third option. What made the lee light particularly effective was not just its mechanical function, but the psychological weight it carried for the men in the boats below. The darkness that had felt protective was now demonstrably unreliable. A U-boat crew surfacing to charge batteries after sunset could never again do so with the easy confidence that had characterized the earlier years. Every hour on the surface was now threaded through with a different quality of tension, a watchfulness that had not previously been necessary at night, a readiness to crash dive that demanded its own toll in concentration and exhaustion. The bay transit had always been an unpleasant passage. Now it was becoming something that consumed men's nerves along with their fuel, and the accumulated stress of crossing those 700 or so kilometers, while wondering whether a searchlight was about to appear from the sky above, was a burden that grew heavier with every transit. Coastal Command, for its part, was discovering that capability and capacity were two different things. The lee light Wellingtons were effective, but there were never enough of them. The patrol lines were never as dense as the planners wished, and the bay was vast enough that considerable stretches of it remained effectively unwatched, even during the night hours. The system worked when it worked, but gaps existed, and experienced U-boat commanders knew how to exploit them, choosing routes and timing windows where the probability of an encounter was lowest. The mathematics of the patrol, rather than the mechanics of the searchlight, would ultimately determine how complete the night offensive could be. Operational research would later provide the tools to attack that problem more systematically, but in this first phase, the combination of ASV Mark II and the ley light had accomplished something that earlier years of effort had not. It had made the Bay of Biscay dangerous at night, and it had handed Coastal Command a tool that, for a brief and precious interval before the Germans found an answer, tilted the balance in ways the early, frustrated patrols of 1940 could not have imagined. The highway through the darkness was no longer free. For a few weeks in the summer of 1942, something changed in the Bay of Biscay. U-boat commanders who had grown quietly accustomed to the rhythms of the transit, the long surface run to build battery charge, the grey rolling swells, the relative safety of night, began to notice that the nights were no longer safe. Aircraft were finding them in the dark. Not by chance, not by the occasional lucky sighting against a phosphorescent wake, but with a regularity that felt systematic, deliberate, and deeply unsettling. A submarine running on the surface at 2 in the morning, no moon, no horizon, nothing visible for miles in any direction, would suddenly be caught in a blinding column of white light dropping from the sky. Then the charges, then silence, or not silence. The Lee Light and its partner technology, ASV Mark II radar, had turned the darkness into a weapon against the very men who had come to depend on it. The losses were not catastrophic in raw numbers, not yet, but they were pointed. They carried the particular sting of losses that cannot be explained by bad luck or poor seamanship. When a boat went down on a clear day to a well-pressed attack, that was understood, dangerous, costly, but comprehensible within the logic of war at sea. When boats began disappearing in conditions that should have guaranteed invisibility, the psychological damage ran deeper than the material one. Crews talked. Survivors were debriefed. Dönitz's staff began to piece together a pattern. The aircraft were not stumbling onto these boats. They were being guided. The question that now consumed the attention of German naval intelligence and of the scientists and engineers attached to the U-boat arm was how and what could be done about it before the Bay transit became genuinely untenable. The answer the Germans arrived at was not a counterweapon in any aggressive sense. It was something simpler, more elegant, and in the end more immediately effective. If Allied aircraft were broadcasting radar pulses to find surfaced submarines, then those pulses were also radiating outward in all directions, including downward, toward the surface of the sea, toward the very boats they were searching for. A submarine equipped with a sensitive enough receiver could detect those pulses, identify the approaching aircraft by its radar signature, and dive long before any weapon could be brought to bear. The aircraft would arrive at a position to find nothing but open water. The ocean would give nothing back. The principle was straightforward, translating it into a working device that could function in the brutal physical environment of a submarine at sea, under combat conditions, with crews who were exhausted and not necessarily trained technicians. That was the engineering challenge. What emerged was a device known as the Metox, taking its name from the French company Metox that manufactured it. It was not a sleek piece of precision engineering. By any objective measure, it was crude. The antenna, hastily designed and constructed from wood and wire, was nicknamed the Biscay Cross by the men who used it, because that is what it resembled, a rough wooden cross fitted with a loop of wire that had to be carried up through the conning tower hatch and assembled by hand on the bridge before it could function. Every time a boat submerged, the cross had to be brought back below, or it would be lost. In foul weather or urgent circumstances, this was a significant operational complication. The receiver unit itself was a small box connected to headphones. A trained operator would listen for the characteristic audio tone that indicated an ASV radar signal was present. When the tone grew louder, the aircraft was closing. The system was, in essence, a man with headphones standing in the noise and vibration of a submarine bridge, listening for a sound that meant someone was hunting him. It worked. With a speed that caught Allied planners completely off guard, the Metox transformed the tactical situation in the Bay of Biscay. Through the late summer and into the autumn of 1942, Coastal Command's kill rate, which had been climbing promisingly through the spring and early summer as the Lee Light began to show results, simply collapsed. Aircraft were completing patrols across the bay and finding nothing. Submarines were transiting at night again, safely, because they could hear the radar pulses coming and dive before any aircraft closed to visual range. The Lee Light, which had briefly made the night dangerous for U-boat crews, became almost irrelevant, because by the time an aircraft was close enough to switch on its searchlight and illuminate a target, the target was gone. The device that had given Coastal Command its first genuine edge in the nighttime transit war had been neutralized, not by matching technology, not by a better radar or a new aircraft, but by a simple warning receiver that cost almost nothing to produce. The effect on Allied planning was severe. The officers who had championed the Lee Light program and who had watched the early kill statistics with quiet satisfaction now faced a graph that went in entirely the wrong direction. Coastal Command was flying more hours over the bay than ever before, burning fuel, wearing out aircraft and crews, and finding less. The bay was not becoming a killing ground, it was becoming an expensive ocean to cross without result. Within the command structure, there was frustration, and beneath the frustration, a sharper anxiety. The North Atlantic convoy battles were intensifying. U-boats that transited the bay safely arrived at hunting grounds, where Allied merchant shipping losses were reaching levels that threatened the entire supply chain, sustaining Britain's war effort. Every boat that slipped through the bay unharmed was a potential death sentence for the crews of merchant ships it would later encounter. What made the Metox particularly demoralizing from the Allied perspective was the speed of its adoption. The device had not required months of industrial production or complex supply chain logistics. It had been relatively quickly manufactured, distributed to the U-boat fleet, and put into operational use. The transition was not seamless. Some commanders were more diligent than others in ensuring Metox watches were properly maintained, and the requirement to handle the wooden antenna on the bridge in rough Atlantic weather was a genuine inconvenience. But the broad effect was almost immediate. Coastal Command had spent months developing, testing, and deploying the radar and searchlight combination. The Germans had answered it in a fraction of the time, not by matching the sophistication of the technology, but by exploiting one of its inherent physical characteristics. It was a lesson about the nature of electronic warfare that would echo through the entire campaign. Inside the bay, the mood shifted. German submariners who had been receiving grim reports about Lee Light attacks and had approached the Biscay transit with growing unease began to regain confidence. The Metox watch became a standard part of the bridge routine, as normal as watching for aircraft with the naked eye. The wooden cross went up, the headphones went on, and men listened as they crossed the bay again under cover of something that felt, once more, like genuine darkness. Dernitz's operations staff tracked the statistics and noted the improvement. The transit route was open again. The wolf packs could reach the Atlantic. Whatever crisis the Lee Light had threatened to create had been averted, for now, by a box and a pair of headphones. But the deeper significance of what had just happened was not yet fully visible to either side. The Bay of Biscay campaign had crossed a threshold. It was no longer purely a question of aircraft against submarines, weapons against armor, speed against depth. It had become something more technically complex, more cerebral, and in some ways more relentless, an electronic warfare contest in which each new capability would generate a counter-capability, each advantage would eventually be answered, and the tempo of technological change would be as decisive as the courage of the men fighting. The Metox had not ended the campaign, it had transformed it, introducing a new layer of competition that would run beneath every subsequent phase of the fight. Allied scientists and planners knew this even as they absorbed the disappointment of the kill statistics. The ASV Mark II radar operated on a wavelength that the Metox could detect precisely because that wavelength was long enough for its relatively simple receiver to capture. The answer, in principle, was a radar that operated on a shorter wavelength, one that a device like the Metox could not hear, or could not hear until it was too late. Centimetric radar technology, which would eventually deliver exactly that capability, was already under development in British laboratories. But development is not deployment. The months between a working prototype and an operational device installed in a Coastal Command aircraft flying patrols over the Bay of Biscay were months in which U-boats continued to transit, continued to reach the Atlantic, and continued to sink ships. The intellectual solution was visible on the horizon. The operational problem remained fully and lethally present. There was another complication, quieter and more insidious, that would only become apparent over time. The Metox receiver, by its nature, was not a passive device in the way its operators believed. While it listened for radar pulses, it also generated its own low-level radio frequency emissions, a faint, unintended byproduct of its oscillator circuit. In the short term, this was not understood by either side. But it planted a seed of vulnerability in the very technology the Germans had deployed to keep themselves safe, a vulnerability that Allied intelligence would eventually identify and attempt to exploit in ways the German engineers who built the Metox could never have anticipated. The irony was buried in the physics, invisible for now, waiting. For the men crossing the bay in the autumn of 1942, none of this future complexity was felt. What was felt was the return of something resembling safety in the night. The wooden cross went up, the headphones came on, the operator listened, and below the surface, the ocean rolled on, without giving anything away. By the autumn of 1942, the war at sea had reached a point of naked crisis. The instruments measuring Allied fortunes were simple and brutal: ships departing, ships arriving, and the growing, widening gap between the two. Every week, the logs of the Admiralty's Trade Division told a story that senior officers read in private and discussed in whispers. Merchant tonnage was being consumed faster than Allied shipyards could replace it, and the arithmetic of that equation pointed in only one direction. The convoys threading westward across the North Atlantic were the circulatory system of the Allied war effort, carrying oil, grain, ammunition, aircraft, tanks, and the 10,000 other necessities without which the armies gathering in Britain could not exist, let alone fight. Each ship lost was not merely a column of steel sent to the bottom, it was fuel that would not reach an airfield, food that would not reach a table, steel that would not become a weapon. The ocean was eating the war. The men who commanded the U-boat arm understood this arithmetic as well as any economist. Admiral Karl Dönitz had constructed his entire strategic vision around a single proposition: sink enough tonnage, and Britain would be strangled before American industrial power could tip the balance. His calculations were precise, almost clinical. He had estimated the tonnage threshold that would render British survival impossible, and through the closing months of 1942, the monthly sinkings were trending toward that threshold with a consistency that should have been impossible. In the North Atlantic, wolf packs were finding convoys across enormous stretches of ocean, striking in coordinated waves across multiple nights, and withdrawing before escort forces could bring decisive force to bear. The system was working. The question Dönitz faced was not whether his boats could sink enough ships. They demonstrably could, but whether the transit corridor between his French bases and the killing grounds could remain open long enough for the campaign to reach its conclusion. The convoy battles of late 1942 were not individual disasters so much as a sustained, grinding hemorrhage. Slow convoys crossing the mid-Atlantic gap, that region beyond the range of shore-based air cover from both Britain and North America, found themselves exposed for days at a time, with escort groups that were too small, too tired, and too poorly equipped to hold the wolf packs at distance. The waters of the central Atlantic were so vast that a convoy finding itself attacked on a November night could not realistically hope for aerial reinforcement before the damage was done. Merchant sailors learned to live with a specific, rational fear: the knowledge that a torpedo could arrive without warning, that the sea at those latitudes in autumn was cold enough to kill a man in minutes, and that the nearest friendly aircraft might be 800 kilometers away. The escorts fought with everything they had, but they were fighting a mathematics of attrition they could not overcome. The early months of 1943 compressed these pressures into an almost unbearable intensity. 2 convoy engagements in the North Atlantic during late winter sent shockwaves through the Allied command structure that went far beyond the tonnage columns. Slow convoys were savaged by wolf packs, operating in coordinated numbers not previously seen, more than 20 boats at a time, pressing attacks across multiple consecutive nights, exhausting escorts, and stripping convoys of their protective screen through sheer relentless pressure. The losses across those engagements ran into dozens of ships. The escorting warships fought with genuine ferocity, sinking several of the attacking U-boats, but the exchange rate was still running against the Allies. Officers at Western Approaches Command, who read the action reports, felt something beyond professional concern, something closer to dread at what the numbers implied about the campaign's direction. It was in this atmosphere that Winston Churchill composed what became perhaps the most quoted private statement of his wartime leadership. In a memorandum circulated among his closest advisors, he described the U-boat threat as the only thing that had truly frightened him during the war. The man who had stood before Parliament and offered nothing but blood, toil, tears and sweat. The man who had survived the Blitz and watched the fall of Singapore and Tobruk without flinching from his public composure, was quietly confessing to genuine fear. The German surface fleet had been neutralized. The Luftwaffe had failed to break British resolve, but the submarines, working in the darkness beneath the Atlantic, were threatening to accomplish through patient attrition what the Blitz and the Panzer divisions had failed to achieve through shock. Churchill's fear was not theatrical. It was the fear of a leader who could read a graph and understand what happened when a line continued in the direction it was pointing. The response within the Allied command structure was neither calm nor entirely coordinated. There was urgency, argument, and a great deal of institutional friction. Bomber Command, under Air Marshal Arthur Harris, remained resolutely focused on the strategic bombing campaign against German industry and cities, and resisted, with considerable force, any diversion of his heavy aircraft to maritime patrol duties. Harris believed, with the characteristic certainty that defined his tenure, that submarines could most efficiently be destroyed in their pens and in the shipyards that built them, not hunted one by one across millions of square kilometers of ocean. Churchill himself was periodically drawn toward this argument, and it took sustained effort from the naval staff and from Coastal Command's advocates to keep the argument for a Bay of Biscay offensive alive against Harris's formidable institutional resistance. The resources debate was not peripheral to the campaign. It was one of its defining battles. What the analysts and strategists kept returning to, despite all the friction, was a geographical fact of striking simplicity. Every U-boat that left Brest or Lorient or Saint-Nazaire had to cross the Bay of Biscay to reach the Atlantic. Every boat that came home had to cross it again. The bay was roughly 450 kilometers wide at its broadest point and could not be bypassed. It was, in the most direct possible sense, a bottleneck. If aircraft could be concentrated in sufficient numbers to make that transit genuinely dangerous, not occasionally dangerous, but reliably, systematically lethal, then Dönitz's entire operational system would be compromised at its root. He could not send boats to the convoy lanes if those boats were being destroyed before they arrived. The logic was compelling. The question was whether the resources and the technology existed to make it work. Patrick Blackett's operational research group had been applying a rigorous statistical lens to these questions, and their conclusions were beginning to influence doctrine in ways that felt unfamiliar to officers trained in older traditions. Blackett's people were not sailors or airmen. They were mathematicians, physicists, and economists who looked at patrol patterns, detection rates, and kill probability with the same systematic attention a scientist might bring to a laboratory problem. Their analysis suggested that concentrated, persistent patrols of the bay could generate encounter rates high enough to impose unacceptable attrition on U-boats in transit, but only if patrol allocation was restructured away from intuitive dispersal and toward evidence-based concentration. This was not an argument many senior officers found instinctively appealing, but the crisis in the North Atlantic had created a willingness to try things that peace or complacency would never have admitted. The planning process for what would become Operation Enclose began against this backdrop of acute need and intense institutional argument. The concept was direct: a sustained offensive patrol of the Bay of Biscay using long-range aircraft flying in coordinated patterns designed to make the transit corridor as dangerous as possible, around the clock, in all weathers. It required a substantial commitment of aircraft that were simultaneously needed elsewhere for convoy escort, for coastal patrol, for the broader demands of a global war. The negotiations over those aircraft allocations were protracted and sometimes acrimonious. But the convoy crisis had stripped away the luxury of indefinite delay. The figures coming out of the North Atlantic made inaction a more dangerous choice than commitment. There was also a change in institutional mood that had been building across 1942 and was now reaching a kind of critical density. Coastal Command had spent 2 years being treated as the poor relation of British air power, chronically under-resourced flying aircraft that other commands had declined, and accumulating a reputation in some quarters as a branch where careers went to stall. The officers who had laboured through those years of inadequacy had developed something beyond ordinary professional motivation. There was a sharpness to their advocacy, a particular quality of determination that came from long frustration approaching the edge of its patience. Air Marshal John Slessor, who would take command of Coastal Command in early 1943, brought to that role not only considerable tactical intelligence, but a willingness to fight the institutional battles his predecessors had sometimes lost. The Bay offensive would need both qualities in equal measure. For the U-boat crews completing their Baltic training and arriving at Lorient and Brest for the first time, the Bay of Biscay crossing had always carried a background hum of danger. But through 1942, that danger had felt manageable. A few hundred kilometers of anxious transit, mostly at night, mostly submerged or at quick dive readiness, before the open Atlantic opened ahead and the real work began. That background hum was about to become something considerably louder. The men who would be ordered to take boats through the bay in the spring and early summer of 1943 would encounter a different kind of passage, one for which their training, however thorough, had not fully prepared them. The Allies were done treating the bay as a corridor. They intended to turn it into a trap. The crisis of late 1942 and early 1943 was thus the engine that drove everything that followed. It stripped away arguments that might otherwise have preserved comfortable institutional arrangements. It forced resources toward a theatre that had previously been treated as secondary. And it concentrated the minds of planners, scientists, naval officers, and air crews on a simple, hard proposition. If the bay transit could not be made lethal, the convoys would continue to die, and with them, the possibility of mounting any serious offensive against the European mainland. The Bay of Biscay had always been geographically central. Now, in the cold arithmetic of March 1943, it became strategically decisive. The offensive was coming. By the winter of 1942, a fundamental shift had begun inside British strategic thinking. The convoy crisis had reached a point where survival itself hung in question. Churchill's private fears were becoming operational urgency. In the corridors of Whitehall, a single conclusion had crystallized. The Bay of Biscay was no longer a secondary concern. It was the place where the entire Atlantic War would be decided. What had been a scattered, under-resourced policing operation would transform into something altogether more formidable, a coordinated, relentless offensive designed not merely to harass U-boats, but to make the transit of the bay so catastrophically dangerous that Dönitz would have no choice but to abandon it. The operation would carry the codename Enclose. Its execution would rest on the shoulders of one man, Air Marshal John Slessor, a strategist whose vision would reshape the very nature of anti-submarine warfare. Slessor arrived at Coastal Command in February of 1943 with a mandate to prosecute the Bay offensive with a new intensity. Unlike his predecessors, he possessed both the authority to demand additional aircraft and the strategic vision to know exactly how to employ them. He was not a believer in the scattered patrols of the early war period, aircraft dispersed across vast stretches of ocean. often flying blind, rarely encountering their quarry. Instead, he brought with him a doctrine that would prove revolutionary in its simplicity and devastating in its effect. The bay would be divided into sectors. These sectors would be patrolled continuously, without gaps, without rest. The patrols would be flown low and fast, coordinated with surface forces below, timed and shaped according to data rather than intuition. Schlesser believed that if enough aircraft could be concentrated on the bay with sufficient frequency, the mathematics of the problem would shift in Britain's favour, and the man who would provide those mathematics was a scientist named Patrick Blackett. Blackett had arrived at Coastal Command's headquarters as head of the Air Ministry's Operational Research Group, a small but fiercely intelligent unit of scientists and mathematicians tasked with extracting actionable intelligence from raw operational data. Where previous commanders had relied on experience and instinct, Blackett asked a different question. What does the data tell us? He examined convoy losses, patrol frequencies, aircraft endurance, U-boat transit patterns. He interrogated every available piece of information with the precision of a physicist looking at an experimental result. And what emerged from his analysis was both elegant and brutal. The problem was not that aircraft lacked range or power. The problem was distribution. The British were flying the right number of sorties, but in the wrong places at the wrong times. By shifting patrol patterns according to predicted U-boat routes, by concentrating aircraft density at choke points and crossing areas, by timing patrol rotations to maximize the chance of a surfaced contact, Schlesser and Blackett calculated they could increase kill probability by a factor of several times over. The bay could be sealed. It would take the right tools, the right numbers, and the right coordination. And in early 1943, for the first time in the war, those tools and numbers were finally becoming available. The aircraft began to arrive in February and March. Consolidated Liberators, American-built long-range bombers converted for anti-submarine work, capable of carrying enough fuel and weapons to remain over the bay for hours at a time. Sunderlands, twin-hulled flying boats, older but proven, with the range to loiter and the firepower to attack. Halifaxes, heavily armed four-engine bombers, sturdy and reliable, bristling with machine guns and depth charges. Wellingtons, the workhorses of Coastal Command, twin-engine, twin-boom aircraft that had been modified with the latest radar and sensor equipment. And there were others, Whitley bombers, Anson patrol aircraft, Avro Lancasters stripped down and reconfigured for submarine hunting. By April, Coastal Command had assembled something it had never possessed before, an overwhelming concentration of air power in a defined geographic area, freed from the competing demands of Bomber Command and Fighter Command, focused entirely on one objective. In the skies above the Bay of Biscay, the Allies had achieved something close to air superiority. For the U-boat arm, accustomed to transiting with near impunity in the daylight hours, the change would be sudden and shocking. The METOX warning receiver, which had rendered the Lee light all but useless, had created a false sense of security inside the U-boat command. Dönitz and his staff believed they had found the answer to the nighttime threat. Boats would transit only at night, METOX would detect the radar emissions, and the crew would dive to safety. During daylight, when aircraft were operating and visibility was good, U-boats would remain submerged and creep across the bay at their painfully slow underwater speed, perhaps 3 or 4 knots, consuming weeks for a journey that should take days. But they would survive. The mathematics seemed to work. What Dönitz did not yet know was that Schlesor's offensive was not designed to fit into the U-boat's schedule. The new doctrine called for continuous patrols, day and night. The aircraft would come again and again, in relays, in waves, never allowing the bay to rest. A U-boat might successfully transit the bay once, twice, perhaps 3 times, but eventually the odds would catch up. 1 aircraft, 1 contact, 1 attack, and the boat was gone. Dönitz's crews soon discovered this truth. The effect was immediate and demoralizing. The first weeks of the sustained offensive produced modest results, but the trend was ominous from the German perspective. Individual U-boats were sunk, convoys continued, but their escorts, forewarned by radio intelligence, could now anticipate which boats were operating and where. The pressure began to mount. By late March, the first of Blackett's predictions were proving accurate. Aircraft concentrations at known transit choke points were producing contacts at a rate that matched or exceeded theoretical estimates. The coastal command crews, many of whom had grown weary from months of flying over empty ocean, suddenly found themselves genuinely engaged. A Sunderland crew would depart their base in Cornwall or Scotland, locate a U-boat on radar in the gathering dusk, illuminate it with the lee light, and press home an attack with depth charges, all within the span of perhaps 5 minutes. The U-boat, detecting the radar on its METOX and preparing to dive, would find itself already under attack, already crippled or sunk. The margin between detection and destruction had shrunk to almost nothing. For German submariners, the psychological impact was devastating. The feeling of invulnerability that had characterized the first happy time was dead. But the genius of Schlesel's plan extended beyond simply increasing aircraft numbers. The true innovation lay in the integration of air and surface power. As Coastal Command drove U-boats down with their attacks, they were no longer escaping into emptiness. Below the surface, Royal Navy forces were waiting. The second support group under Captain Frederick Walker, a destroyer flotilla composed of the most aggressively commanded warships in the Royal Navy, was now operating in the bay in close coordination with Coastal Command. When an aircraft pressed home an attack and forced a U-boat to dive, the warships would be vectored to the location by radio and arrive to prosecute with depth charges and other anti-submarine weapons. The U-boat, battered by air attack and now facing surface opposition, found itself trapped in a mechanical vice. It could surface and try to escape on the diesel, but aircraft would be overhead within minutes. It could remain submerged and creep away, but warships would be hunting it acoustically, converging on sound-bearing ranges. The combination was nearly impossible to survive. Schlesser had created the first true hunter-killer team of the war, not just aircraft fighting submarines in isolation, but aircraft and ships working in perfect coordination to corner and destroy their quarry. The effect was cumulative, building month by month through the spring of 1943. The Coastal Command crews who flew these missions were operating on a different plane of existence than their German counterparts. American and British pilots and observers who flew Liberators, Sunderlands, and Halifaxes spent 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours in the air, scanning radar screens and searching visually across grey water that stretched to every horizon. They operated in appalling weather. The Bay of Biscay in early 1943 was a place of constant cloud, frequent gales, and visibility measured in hundreds of yards rather than miles. They fought not against enemies in the air, but against the ocean itself, against engine unreliability, against navigation challenges that pushed crews to the absolute limits of their skill and endurance. When a contact was finally established, the attack itself required precision, nerve, and perfect timing. A pilot diving toward a small, moving target in poor visibility, flying a heavy and sluggish aircraft that responded slowly to control inputs, pressed toward a U-boat that was attempting to dive while the crew fired back with flak guns. This was a test of human capacity that would leave a mark on every man who endured it. And they endured it repeatedly. The rotation system meant that the best crews flew multiple sorties per week. Exhaustion accumulated. The strain was enormous, yet the sortie rates climbed. By May, Coastal Command was flying more than 500 sorties per month over the bay. The sheer volume of effort created a grinding, relentless pressure that the U-boat arm could not sustain. The data that Blackett and his operational research group had generated proved to be extraordinarily accurate. As the weeks of the offensive accumulated, the kill rate climbed in ways that matched the theoretical models. In April alone, Coastal Command and surface forces accounted for the destruction of 4 U-boats in the bay, a modest number by later standards, but for the time, it represented a dramatic acceleration. May would prove even more lethal. The U-boat command, watching the casualty reports accumulate, faced a crisis of tactical doctrine. Boats transiting the bay were no longer enjoying the respite they had anticipated. The Metox receiver, once the solution to the Lee light threat, was no longer sufficient. A new weapon was needed. In the meantime, Dönitz issued new orders. U-boats would fight back. If attacked on the surface, crews would man their flak guns and stand their ground. Submersion was now the worst option. It left the boats slow and vulnerable to surface forces. Fight, Dönitz ordered. Stay above water and shoot down the aircraft before they could drop their depth charges. This instruction would transform the Bay campaign into something far more violent and intimate. It would also mark the moment when the Allies finally began to understand that they were winning. The psychological shift within Coastal Command was palpable as April transitioned into May of 1943. The frustration of previous years, the patrols that found nothing, the radar contacts that turned out to be false, the sense of vast ocean and tiny aircraft pitted against an elusive enemy, had been replaced by something altogether different: purpose. The patrol areas that had seemed empty now produced regular contacts. The aircraft that had seemed inadequate were now proving their worth. Crews who had endured months of training without seeing a U-boat were now engaging them regularly. The tone of radio reports and debriefing sessions shifted from resigned persistence to something approaching confidence. Not arrogance, the crews had seen too much to become overconfident, but a genuine belief that the bay could be sealed, that transits could be made fatally expensive, that the operation was no longer a holding action, but an offensive that was genuinely winning. Slessor, reviewing the operational data week by week, saw his hypothesis being validated in real time. The numbers were working. The doctrine was working. The concentration of air power, guided by Blackett's statistical analysis, was producing results that would have been unimaginable 18 months earlier. By the end of April, he and his staff could see the outline of the next phase forming. Not whether the offensive could succeed, but how far and how fast it could drive the U-boats out of the bay entirely. Yet even as the Allies surged forward, even as aircraft and warships achieved unprecedented coordination and effectiveness, the campaign was entering a new and more dangerous phase. Dönitz, responding to losses that were now undeniable, was preparing a tactical response that would turn the Bay campaign from a battle of aircraft against submerged vessels into something far more visceral and direct. U-boats, under new orders, would face aircraft not by diving, but by fighting. Machine guns and flak cannons would replace the hope of evasion. The waters of the bay would become a killing ground not just for submarines, but for air crews as well. May 1943 was approaching, and with it would come the most violent and most desperate phase of the entire campaign. The offensive that had begun with Slessor's conviction and Blackett's mathematics was about to enter a new dimension where courage and endurance would matter as much as tactical innovation. The U-boat arm had decided to make a stand. The air war above the Bay of Biscay was only half the battle. While Coastal Command's aircraft hunted in the skies, the Royal Navy was preparing its own offensive beneath the waves, a coordinated surface assault that would turn the bay into something far more dangerous than U-boats had ever encountered. The innovation that made this possible was not new technology, but rather a new way of thinking about warfare itself. The Royal Navy understood that submarines, when forced to the surface, were vulnerable. The challenge was to force them up and keep them there long enough for surface warships to deliver the killing blow. This would require coordination, timing, and a ruthlessness that few naval commanders possessed in adequate measure. But one man would emerge who embodied all three: Captain Frederick John Walker, whose tactical genius and relentless aggression would make the second support group the most lethal anti-submarine formation in the entire Royal Navy. Walker came to this war with an unusual pedigree. He had served in the First World War, had spent the interwar years in relative obscurity, and had been actively opposed to the very concept of anti-submarine warfare as a distinct naval discipline. Yet by 1942, he had undergone a transformation. He had read the statistics of merchant ships sunk, had studied the tactics of successful U-boat commanders, and had concluded that existing British anti-submarine doctrine was fundamentally inadequate. When he took command of the Second Support Group in 1942, he inherited a formation of sloops and corvettes, small, unglamorous vessels designed for convoy escort, and he set about turning them into the most aggressive submarine hunters in the Navy. His tactical philosophy was deceptively simple: speed, concentration of force, continuous pressure, and absolute refusal to let a wounded U-boat escape. Where other commanders saw the risks, Walker saw opportunity. Where others hesitated, he attacked. The composition of Walker's force reflected both the constraints of British warship production and the practical requirements of anti-submarine warfare. His flagships were sloops, the Starling, the Woodpecker, the Wren, and others of their class, small, lightly armed, but fast enough and maneuverable enough to hunt effectively in confined waters. These were complemented by corvettes, even smaller and more numerous, their hulls powered by reciprocating engines that gave them limited speed but sufficient endurance for the grueling work of prolonged bay patrols. On paper, these vessels seemed fragile, almost toy-like, compared to the destroyers and cruisers that commanded the attention of the Admiralty. Yet in the hands of Walker and his captains, they became instruments of extraordinary lethality. Each boat was fitted with the latest depth charge racks, throwers that could hurl explosives laterally as well as astern, and a new piece of technology called the Hedgehog, a forward-throwing mortar that fired a pattern of small contact detonating bombs ahead of the attacking ship, rather than forcing the attacker to pass directly over the target. The psychological effect on U-boat crews was devastating. Traditional depth charges meant the defending submarine heard the approaching warship and had seconds to attempt evasion. The Hedgehog gave no such warning. The coordination between Coastal Command aircraft and Walker's surface vessels represented a qualitative leap in anti-submarine tactics. In the earlier years of the war, when an aircraft detected a U-boat on the surface, it would attack with whatever weapons it carried, typically depth charges with limited accuracy or fragmentation bombs with minimal effect. The U-boat, alerted by the first aircraft, would dive and vanish beneath the waves, leaving the aircraft circling uselessly above. Walker's innovation was to establish a rigid protocol of communication and mutual support. When a Coastal Command aircraft detected a U-boat in the bay, it would shadow the contact, maintaining contact through cloud breaks or radar returns, and radio the nearest surface escort group with precise position, course, and speed. The surface vessels would race toward the contact, often arriving within hours. The aircraft would continue to shadow the target, preventing it from diving by threatening constant attacks or forcing it to remain submerged, and thus making slow, predictable progress underwater. When the surface escorts arrived, the aircraft would coordinate the final attack, using their speed and altitude to drive the U-boat down at precisely the moment the surface vessels were in position to deliver the killing blow. The effectiveness of this layered approach became apparent in the spring of 1943, during the height of Operation Enclose. The 1st, 2nd, and 37th Escort Groups, with Walker's 2nd Support Group leading the way, began to operate in a manner that was almost unprecedented in naval warfare. Rather than patrolling fixed zones, they adopted a mobile hunting posture, moving rapidly from one area of reported U-boat activity to another. The group would maintain a tight formation, with the flagship in the center, coordinating the movements of smaller vessels, and would establish a combat information center in which all radar returns, radio reports from aircraft, and acoustic detections were plotted in real time. The result was a form of integrated warfare that anticipated by several decades the concepts that would become standard in modern naval operations. When contact was made with a U-boat, the entire formation responded within minutes. The human cost of this style of warfare was severe for both sides. A U-boat forced to the surface by air attack faced a grim choice: dive and risk being trapped by incoming surface escorts with no escape route, or remain on the surface and attempt to fight back with the heavy anti-aircraft guns that had recently been added to German submarines. For the crews of the attacking aircraft, pressing home an attack on a U-boat that was shooting back with dedicated anti-aircraft weaponry required courage bordering on suicidal. The pilot and crew knew that a well-aimed burst from a German 20mm cannon could shatter the fuselage of a Wellington or Liberator in seconds. Yet again and again, Coastal Command crews did exactly that, pressing through the anti-aircraft fire to deliver their depth charges or bombs. For the surface escorts, the danger came from new German weapons: the acoustic homing torpedo designed to track and sink the attacking warship, but also from the sheer physical demands of the pursuit, which often extended for many hours in heavy seas with insufficient rest. Walker himself became legendary among his captains for his tactical audacity and his willingness to accept risk. His flag officers and senior rates would later recall moments in which he had maneuvered his light vessels deliberately close to U-boats in order to achieve precise depth charge patterns, knowing that a well-placed torpedo could sink a small sloop as easily as a large destroyer. He demanded the same ruthlessness from his officers and men. In the officers' wardrooms of the Starling and Woodpecker, a culture developed that was almost unique in the Royal Navy. A culture of aggressive anti-submarine warfare, of contempt for the rules of engagement that required commanders to break contact if it became too costly, and of absolute faith in the captain's judgment. When Walker received a signal that a U-boat had been sighted in a particular grid square, his immediate response was to question how soon his ships could be at the location, not whether they should go. His senior first lieutenant would later write that Walker had an almost supernatural ability to predict where a damaged or evasive U-boat would attempt to go, and would position his ships accordingly. The spring of 1943 saw the 2nd Support Group operating at the height of its offensive power. The coordinated air-sea attacks that Walker's doctrine enabled began to inflict losses on the U-boat arm at a rate that German intelligence struggled to explain. U-boats that had escaped from air attack were forced back to the surface by the threat of surface escort arrival and killed in close-range engagements. Others, attempting to evade by diving deep, found their hiding places rendered useless by new acoustic detection equipment. By May of that year, the cumulative effect had become devastating. The U-boat commanders who survived encounters with Walker's 2nd Support Group spoke of it with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. It was not the individual vessels, any U-boat outgunned a single sloop, but the coordination, the aggression, and the absolute refusal to grant respite that broke the will of German submariners. Where Dönitz had built his Wolfpack doctrine on the assumption that a U-boat's greatest vulnerability was in the transit phase and that speed and darkness would provide sufficient protection, Walker had demonstrated that neither speed nor darkness meant anything if the enemy could concentrate overwhelming force at the point of contact. The contribution of the Royal Navy's surface escorts to the Bay campaign has often been overshadowed by the more visible and dramatic achievements of Coastal Command's aircraft. The official histories tend to emphasize the statistical contribution of air power, and the casualty figures do bear this out. More U-boats were sunk by aircraft than by surface vessels during the Bay offensive. Yet this quantitative measure obscures a crucial qualitative truth. It was the threat of surface escorts, coordinated with air patrols, that made the entire system work. A U-boat that knew that aircraft were overhead and that surface vessels were hours away might choose to remain submerged and accept the speed penalty. But a U-boat that knew that if it remained submerged it would be caught by faster surface vessels, and if it surfaced, it would face air attack, had no acceptable course of action. Each element of the defense forced the U-boat toward the threat posed by the other element. The precision coordination required to make this work fell primarily on the shoulders of men like Walker and the captains and officers of the escort vessels who understood his intentions without needing explicit orders. By the early summer of 1943, the pattern was becoming clear to German high command. U-boats that had once transited the bay with a reasonable expectation of reaching open water were now facing a killing zone that seemed to grow more lethal with each attempt. Dönitz's operational logs recorded his growing dismay. Reports from successful boats described coordinated attacks by aircraft and surface vessels, the arrival of warships within hours of air attack, the use of sophisticated detection equipment that seemed to work in fog and darkness with equal effectiveness. The morale of U-boat crews began to suffer as the reality of their situation became apparent. The happy confidence of the early war years, the sense among German submariners that they possessed superior tactics and technology, gave way to a grimmer understanding. They were being hunted by an enemy that had learned to fight on 3 dimensions simultaneously: air, surface, and underwater, and the enemy was proving more skilled at this integrated warfare than the Germans had anticipated. The question that began to haunt Dönitz was not whether the bay could be held, but whether it could be transited at all. The strategic implications extended far beyond the bay itself. The ability of the Allies to maintain this multi-layered defense, to coordinate air and surface forces effectively, and to accept the technological innovation cycle required to stay ahead of German countermeasures, depended on resources, infrastructure, and intellectual capital that Britain possessed, but that were finite and constantly stretched. The training of escort captains, the coordination between different branches of the service, the integration of radar and acoustic detection with traditional naval tactics, all of this represented the accumulated effort of British naval innovation and doctrine development. In some ways, Walker and his officers were not just fighting U-boats, they were demonstrating that the Royal Navy, despite its numerical inferiority to the German surface fleet in other theatres, possessed tactical flexibility and operational creativity that the German Navy could not match. This would become increasingly relevant as the campaign progressed, and German technological responses forced yet further adaptation. The second support group would pay for its aggressiveness. Ships would be lost, men would die, and the strain of continuous operations would wear on officers and ratings alike. But the principle that Walker had established, that integrated, coordinated, aggressive anti-submarine warfare could break the U-boat's dominance, would persist throughout the remainder of the Bay campaign and would influence naval doctrine for decades to come. The tables were turning against Admiral Dönitz, and he knew it. By the middle of 1943, the Bay of Biscay had become a graveyard. U-boats that had once transited the shallow waters with little more than routine caution now faced a gauntlet of aircraft and warships that grew more lethal by the week. The introduction of centimetric radar had blindsided the German command, the Metox warning receiver, which had given U-boats precious minutes to dive before attack, was now useless against this new invisible threat. Losses were mounting faster than replacements could be built. In the high command bunker at Lorient and in the operational headquarters at Berlin, a desperate strategic question had begun to crystallize. If U-boats could not hide from the air, and diving made them slow and vulnerable, what if they simply refused to dive at all? What if they stayed on the surface, fought back, and tried to shoot their attackers down before those attackers could strike? It was a radical departure from everything U-boat doctrine had taught, and it would transform the bay into an arena of close, brutal, and utterly unprecedented surface warfare. The order came down from Dönitz in the second week of May 1943. U-boats operating in the Bay of Biscay, when attacked by single aircraft, were no longer to dive. Instead, they were to fight. Every operational U-boat was being fitted with upgraded anti-aircraft armament. Twin 20mm and quadruple 20mm flak guns mounted on the conning tower, sometimes accompanied by additional machine gun positions. The crews manning these weapons had trained extensively, often with fanatical intensity, to perfect their gunnery. Dönitz believed that a determined U-boat, firing from a stable platform and operating in coordinated groups, could inflict enough damage on attacking aircraft to make the cost prohibitive. The logic was not unreasonable given the assumptions. A single coastal command aircraft approaching a surfaced U-boat that refused to submerge would be forced to press home its attack through effective anti-aircraft fire. Some aircraft would be damaged, some would be shot down. The calculus, Dönitz hoped, was that the Allies would lose more metal and men than they could afford, and the bay would remain passable. It was a gamble, but it was the only card left to play. For the aircrews of RAF Coastal Command, the order came as a shock that transformed the psychological and physical nature of their mission. Attacking a U-boat that was diving was already dangerous work. The submarine presented a small, moving target, and the depth charge required a precise run-in and release. But attacking a U-boat that was deliberately staying surfaced and shooting back was something altogether different. The men who flew Sunderland flying boats, Liberators, Wellingtons, and Halifaxes, had prepared themselves psychologically to be the hunters. Now, suddenly and without warning, they had been made the hunted as well. The first crews to encounter the new flak traps did so by surprise, and the results were deadly. One Wellington, crewed by 8 men, made an approach on a surfaced U-boat south of Ushant on the 16th of May. The submarine's gunners opened fire at extreme range, their tracers reaching out like glowing fingers into the grey morning sky. The pilot held his course, pressing the attack as doctrine demanded. But the anti-aircraft fire was concentrated and accurate. Shells punched through the aircraft's fuselage and wings. The engines were damaged. The Wellington never recovered and went into the sea. All 8 men died. Within days, more crews were lost to the same tactic. The crisis created a moment of profound disorientation within Coastal Command. The aircraft that had been dealing such devastating losses to U-boats suddenly found themselves taking casualties from that same enemy. The crews understood what was happening. The Germans had changed the rules of engagement, but understanding the tactic and countering it were 2 entirely different problems. Some commanders initially questioned whether the risk was worth the potential gain. Could aircraft afford to press home attacks against a submarine that was now capable of inflicting real damage? The answer, decided at the highest levels of Coastal Command, and with pressure from above, was that they had no choice. The U-boat threat to the Atlantic convoys was too great. The battle for the bay had to be won. And so the order went out to the squadrons. Continue attacking, but adapt your tactics. Approach at different angles and altitudes. Work in pairs, so that one aircraft could attack while the other provided suppressive fire. Get in, release depth charges, and get out. Do not loiter over the target. The damage and risk assessment had to shift to accept higher aircraft losses as the price of keeping the bay lethal to U-boats. What unfolded over the following weeks was a series of fierce, close-range engagements that had no real precedent in the air war over the Atlantic. A Sunderland flying boat, crewed by experienced men from one of the most successful squadrons in Coastal Command, came across a pair of U-boats on the surface, in broad daylight, on the 28th of May. The pilot made the decision to attack the nearer boat, despite the risk. The U-boat's anti-aircraft crews saw the aircraft coming and began firing with meticulous discipline. The Sunderland descended toward the target, all guns blazing. The aircraft itself was heavily armed with machine guns, and the crew poured suppressive fire toward the conning tower, even as the submarine's shells and bullets ripped into the flying boat's hull. The pilot released the depth charges at point-blank range. They straddled the U-boat, but the aircraft had taken catastrophic damage and was barely airborne. The pilot nursed it back toward Cornwall, losing altitude steadily, and managed to put down in the sea just off the coast. The crew got out into a boat and were picked up alive, but the Sunderland was lost. The U-boat that had shot them down, however, was crippled. It limped northward toward the Irish coast, and 3 days later, it was finished off by a British minesweeper. The calculus of survival was becoming clear, Both hunter and hunted were paying in blood and metal for every kill and every escape. The Royal Navy surface forces operating in the bay, under the steady and aggressive command of Captain Frederick Walker, adapted with particular ingenuity to the new flak trap doctrine. Walker's second support group, composed of fast sloops and minesweepers, began coordinating their movements with coastal command aircraft in a new way. When an aircraft made radar contact with a U-boat in the bay, or when patrol aircraft reported a sighting, the surface escort groups would race toward the last known position. If the U-boat had not already submerged, and if the aircraft were already engaging it, the surface vessels would close at maximum speed and attempt to rake the submarine with gunfire while it was distracted by the air attack. The combination of pressure from above and below, the theory went, would overwhelm the U-boat's capacity to fight back effectively. In practice, some of these coordinated attacks worked with devastating results. A U-boat that had fought off initial air attacks found itself suddenly beset by accurate gunfire from fast-moving warships at close range. The submarines had no defense against this kind of coordinated onslaught, and several were sunk in this manner during the months of May and June 1943. Yet the U-boats themselves continued to inflict damage and death. The battles that unfolded across the grey waters of the bay were among the most vicious small-scale engagements of the entire war, and they were conducted with a ferocity that reflected the desperation on both sides. A Whitley bomber, an older aircraft used in the anti-submarine role despite its limitations, encountered a U-boat that refused to dive on the 4th of June. The submarine's flak gunners had clearly trained to a high standard, and they opened fire with disciplined volleys that tore into the bomber's airframe. The pilot of the Whitley, flying an aircraft that was already being pushed to the limits of its capability in the anti-submarine role, pressed on anyway. His crew would remember afterward the shock of seeing the tracers coming at them, the violence of the impacts, and the sudden loss of an engine. He managed to release his depth charges and turn away from the target, but the aircraft was mortally wounded. It crashed into the sea minutes later, and the crew, struggling in the cold water, were picked up by a nearby patrol boat. The U-boat that had shot them down remained on the surface a little longer, hoping for a chance to escape, but was caught by other surface forces and sunk that same afternoon. The cycle repeated itself again and again: attack, counterfire, loss, and eventual destruction of one side or the other. The courage required of the men flying these missions cannot be understated. The pilots and their crews were volunteers who had signed on understanding that their work was dangerous, but the introduction of the flak trap doctrine took that danger to a new and psychologically challenging level. They were now expected to deliberately fly into effective anti-aircraft fire with the knowledge that their aircraft could be shot down before they even got their depth charges away. The crew compositions meant that decisions made in the cockpit affected not just the pilot, but the navigator, the wireless operator, the air gunners, and the men who operated the depth charge racks. A pilot who decided to press home an attack was committing all those men to the same risk he was taking. Some crews became reluctant, others became more aggressive, determined to prove that German flak could not stop them. The most successful squadrons in the bay during this period developed something approaching a culture of controlled aggression. Men who understood the risks, but had made peace with them, who drilled their tactics until they became automatic, and who pressed attacks with a kind of grim professionalism that recognized the stakes of failure. The U-boat crews, for their part, were operating under strain that was nearly unbearable. A submarine that remained surfaced in the bay during daylight, or even at night with aircraft overhead, was burning diesel fuel at a rate that limited its operational endurance significantly. The men manning the anti-aircraft guns were exposed on the conning tower, with no protection except the minimal armor of the gun mounts themselves. They were living targets for the machine gun fire that every attacking aircraft carried. The psychological pressure of knowing that enemy air attacks were coming and that your only defense was to stay visible and shoot back created a tension that slowly wore down morale. The U-boat arm had prided itself on its technical competence and its warrior culture, but the flak trap doctrine was asking something different of the men. Not the careful, calculated efficiency of earlier operations, but raw, desperate courage in the face of overwhelming odds that were becoming clearer by the day. By early summer of 1943, a grueling equilibrium had begun to establish itself in the Bay of Biscay. U-boats that attempted transit faced an almost certain engagement with Allied forces, either air or surface, or both. Some U-boats succeeded in fighting through and making it to the Atlantic, but the attrition was relentless. Coastal Command aircraft losses rose during this period, but not by enough to deter the offensive. The flak trap doctrine, which Dönitz had hoped would turn the tide, instead became another layer in an already catastrophic crisis of survival. The boats that fought and won their local tactical engagements often emerged so damaged that they had to put into port for repairs, further reducing the number of submarines available for operational patrols. The losses mounted. The mood in the U-boat arm shifted from confidence that had characterized the early war years through arrogance, and now into something darker, a grim recognition that the odds were no longer in their favor, and that survival itself had become almost a matter of luck. The true measure of the flak trap campaign came not in any single spectacular naval action, but in the cumulative toll it took on the U-boat arm's capacity to sustain operations. By the time Dönitz made the decision to withdraw the main wolf pack from the Atlantic convoy routes in May of 1943, the U-boats operating in and through the Bay of Biscay had already begun to function as a separate and desperate struggle for mere survival. The tactic had not broken the Allied offensive as Dönitz had hoped it might. Instead, it had extended the agony of the Bay campaign into a new and brutal phase in which neither side could claim an easy victory, but in which the Allies' superior resources and capacity to absorb losses slowly ground down the German resistance. The men who flew against the flak traps and the men who manned those guns on the U-boat conning towers would carry the memory of those grey skies and the visceral reality of close combat for the rest of their lives. They had witnessed a moment in the war when the old rules of engagement had been shattered, and neither side could fully predict what the new rules would bring. By the middle of 1943, the German U-boat arm faced a crisis that no amount of courage or seamanship could resolve. The introduction of centimetric radar had rendered their METOX warning receiver obsolete almost overnight, and losses were accelerating beyond the threshold that even Dönitz's steely resolve could stomach. The wolf packs that had terrorized the Atlantic convoys were being hunted down and destroyed in what the U-boat crews themselves began calling the Donnermonat, the month of thunder. Yet even as the strategic picture darkened, German naval engineers and weapons designers were working in secret to forge a counterattack. They understood, perhaps with painful clarity, that survival in the Bay of Biscay would no longer rest on surface gun battles or evasive diving. The answer, they believed, lay beneath the waves themselves, in the development of weapons that could strike at Allied escort vessels and turn the hunters into hunted. It was a race between invention and counter-invention, and the stakes were measured in ships sunk and men lost. The weapon that emerged from German laboratories was the Zaunkönig, a name meaning wren in German, though the Allies would come to know it by the altogether more sinister designation Gnat. This was not a conventional torpedo that required a submarine captain to aim and fire with precision. Instead, the Zaunkönig was a passive acoustic homing torpedo, the first weapon of its kind to see operational use. Once fired in the general direction of an Allied convoy, the torpedo would listen for the characteristic sound of a ship's propeller, lock onto that acoustic signature, and home toward it with relentless determination. The implications were staggering. An escort vessel no longer had to be directly in the crosshairs. A U-boat commander could launch from a distance, then attempt to escape before the torpedo reached its target. The burden of detection and accurate targeting, which had cost German submariners so much blood already, was partially transferred to the weapon itself. German naval staff believed that the acoustic torpedo would fundamentally alter the balance of the Bay campaign and the broader Atlantic War. The Zaunkönig entered operational service in the late summer of 1943, and it arrived at a moment when German hopes were already badly battered. The first confirmed kill came in September of that year, when a U-boat operating in the Atlantic north of the bay fired the new weapon at the sloop HMS Sharpshooter, escorting a westbound convoy. The torpedo homed unerringly toward the sound of the sloop's propellers and struck the vessel amidships. The explosion tore open the hull, and HMS Sharpshooter sank within minutes, taking with her a significant portion of her crew. The shock rippled through the Allied escort forces. Here was a new threat, one that could not be seen on the surface or detected by conventional means until it struck. The weapon did not require the U-boat to maintain a firing position or even to remain in proximity to its prey. A submarine could fire and run, essentially impossible to hunt down in the chaotic aftermath of a torpedo attack. For the first time in months, the psychological momentum seemed to tilt back toward the German side. Yet even as the Zaunkönig claimed its first victims, the tactical picture remained grimly uncertain for the German command. The acoustic torpedo was temperamental and far from reliable. It required the U-boat to fire from a reasonable proximity to its target, and the sound signature of a ship's propeller, while distinctive, was not always sufficient to guarantee a lock. Some firings resulted in the torpedo running past its intended target or detonating against the convoy's columns in unpredictable directions. The training required to use the weapon effectively was intensive, and many U-boat crews had not yet received instruction in the new firing protocols. More fundamentally, the introduction of the Zaunkönig represented a German admission that surface tactics had become untenable. The U-boats could no longer count on their flak armament to drive off attacking aircraft. The new torpedo was a weapon of the depths, designed for a submarine arm that would henceforth spend most of its time submerged, vulnerable, and blind. The Zaunkönig was not the only innovation that German designers rushed into service during this period. Recognizing that U-boats in the bay would face increasingly intense air attacks, naval engineers developed enhanced anti-aircraft armament packages. By late 1943, U-boats operating in the bay were equipped with substantially heavier machine gun and cannon armament than they had carried only months earlier. Some boats received twin 20mm Oerlikon cannons, in addition to their existing anti-aircraft weaponry. The intention was to make a U-boat sufficiently lethal that Allied aircraft would suffer unacceptable losses if they pressed home their attacks at close range. German commanders hoped that the sheer density of defensive fire from a surfaced U-boat would make the calculus of an air attack less attractive to coastal command pilots. Yet this escalation carried its own penalties. The additional weaponry added weight and reduced submerged performance. The crews required to man these guns further cramped the already claustrophobic interior spaces of the submarines, and training men to effectively operate anti-aircraft weapons while simultaneously managing a submarine in a combat situation demanded a level of seamanship and nerve that not all crews possessed equally. The response from Allied naval and air commanders was swift and methodical. Within weeks of the first Zaunkönig attack, intelligence officers and engineers in Britain had determined the nature of the threat. The acoustic torpedo was homing on propeller noise, and therefore the solution lay in breaking or confusing that acoustic signature. The answer came in the form of the CAT, Countermeasures Against Torpedoes, a device that was essentially a noisemaker towed behind escort vessels on a long wire. The CAT gear generated sounds similar to those produced by a ship's propeller, but it trailed far behind the vessel itself. When a Zaunkönig homed on the acoustic signal, it would follow the decoy and explode harmlessly in the wake, rather than striking the actual ship. It was a deceptively simple solution to an elegant problem, and it required no exotic technology or years of development. Within weeks, CAT gear was being fitted to escort vessels throughout the western approaches and the Bay of Biscay. The introduction of the CAT gear marked a crucial moment in the electronic and acoustic warfare dimension of the campaign. It demonstrated, yet again, that no German weapon remained effective for long once its principle was understood. The Germans had hoped that the Zaunkönig would buy them months of tactical advantage, but they received only weeks. By the autumn of 1943, the acoustic torpedo had already become far less effective than its designers had anticipated. German intelligence analysts, watching the kill rate per torpedo fired decline sharply, concluded that the Allies had discovered some means of defeating the weapon. They were, of course, correct. The entire cycle of innovation and counter-innovation that had characterized the Bay campaign was accelerating. Weapons were being introduced, immediately exploited, and just as quickly neutralized. The pace of technological change meant that advantage accrued to the side with superior resources, manufacturing capacity, and the ability to rapidly retrofit existing equipment across an entire fleet. The human cost of this relentless cycle of tactical innovation fell with particular weight on submarine crews. The introduction of new weapons and new defensive systems meant new training requirements, new operational procedures, and new dangers. U-boat men who had already survived years of intense pressure now faced the prospect of learning entirely new systems under combat conditions. The psychological toll was immense. Crews understood that whatever advantage their new weapon delivered, it would be temporary. The Allies, with their vastly superior industrial capacity and their network of scientific laboratories, would eventually find a counter. The boat that had sailed on patrol, equipped with the latest Zaunkönig torpedoes and enhanced anti-aircraft armament, might return home to find those weapons already partially obsolete. For German submariners in the Bay, 1943 had become a war of diminishing returns. The confidence and arrogance that had characterized the happy times of 1940 and 1941 had long since evaporated, replaced by a grim fatalism. For the Coastal Command aircrew and Royal Navy sailors prosecuting the Bay offensive, the introduction of new German weapons meant a corresponding increase in danger and uncertainty. The aircraft attacking surfaced U-boats now faced more intense and accurate defensive fire. Pilots and airgunners had to develop new tactics to avoid the concentrated anti-aircraft fire coming from below. Some squadrons began developing tactics whereby multiple aircraft would attack simultaneously from different vectors, making it harder for a U-boat's gun crews to concentrate their fire. Others experimented with low-level attack profiles that would bring aircraft in so fast and low that the U-boat had minimal time to react. These were not random innovations. They emerged from the collective experience of crews who had already lost friends and colleagues to anti-aircraft fire. Every tactical adjustment was in some sense a memorial to a crew that had been shot down in a previous engagement. The appearance of the cat gear behind Allied escort vessels represented a kind of ingenuity born of desperation. Naval engineers understood that they could not outrun the acoustic torpedo or detect it with existing sensors. They had to deny the weapon its target by creating false acoustic signatures. The cat gear, trailing hundreds of meters behind a ship, became what might be termed the acoustic equivalent of a naval mine exploded in empty water. It accepted the sacrifice of the decoy in order to save the ship. Sailors understood the logic, but the mechanics of deploying and maintaining cat gear in heavy seas and under combat conditions presented constant practical challenges. The wire could break or become fouled. The device itself could malfunction. A ship running cat gear had to know that a single point of failure in the towing mechanism could render the countermeasure useless. Yet there was no alternative, and thousands of miles of cat gear were manufactured and deployed across the western approaches during the latter months of 1943. By the winter of 1943, the Bay of Biscay had become something more than a simple hunting ground or a transit route. It had transformed into a testing ground for an entirely new category of warfare, one in which physics, mathematics, and industrial capacity mattered as much as seamanship or courage. The Zaunkönig and the cat gear represented the visible manifestations of a broader competition between two sides attempting to dominate an environment that neither fully understood. The Allies possessed greater resources and more sophisticated analytical capabilities. The Germans possessed intimate knowledge of submarine operations and a design bureau capable of rapid innovation. The result was a perpetual arms race, compressed into months rather than years. By the time one side fielded a new weapon or defensive system, the other was already conceptualizing a counter. The human beings involved in this competition, whether German submariners loading acoustic torpedoes into torpedo tubes, or Royal Navy sailors deploying cat gear over the stern of a corvette, understood that they were engaged in something that transcended the traditional logic of naval warfare. The immediate effect of these weapons and countermeasures on the day-to-day conduct of the Bay campaign was complex and asymmetric. The Zaunkönig did sink ships and did force the Allies to expend resources on developing and deploying the cat gear. German submariners, knowing that they possessed a weapon that could strike from the depths and at a distance, took some measure of psychological comfort. Yet the overall trajectory of the campaign did not substantially alter. The acoustic torpedo arrived too late to reverse the technological advantage that centimetric radar had conferred on the Allies. The enhanced anti-aircraft armament on U-boats added a degree of defensive capability, but it did not render surface transits safe or even advisable. The Zaunkönig claimed victims, primarily escort vessels whose loss was a genuine strategic tragedy, but it did not restore the offensive capability that the German U-boat arm had possessed before the catastrophic losses of May 1943. Instead, what the introduction of new weapons and countermeasures truly represented was the grinding, attritional character of the entire Bay campaign. There would be no sudden reversal of fortune, no single innovation that would turn the tide. Both sides were locked into an exhausting cycle of action and reaction, and only one side possessed the resources to sustain the pace indefinitely. In the spring of 1943, the U-boat arm faced a crisis without a face. The losses had returned. Not gradually, not in isolated incidents, but in a pattern so sharp and inexplicable that German intelligence officers found themselves grasping at shadows. The Metox radar warning receiver, that piece of German ingenuity which had neutralized the Lee light and driven Coastal Command into despair only months before, had stopped working, or rather, it seemed to work. The operators reported no unusual radar emissions detected, yet the aircraft still came. They came from nowhere. They came at night. They came in weather. They came when U-boats should have been invisible, and they were accurate. With each attack, with each loss that could not be explained by any known Allied technology, the German command structure fractured a little further from reality. The Kriegsmarine's own officers began to suspect the unthinkable, that there was a spy in their midst, a leak somewhere in the chain of command, someone passing U-boat transit schedules directly to the enemy. The truth was far more elegant and far more devastating. It was not betrayal, it was obsolescence. By the early months of 1943, British and American scientists had accomplished something that appeared impossible. They had shrunk radar down to a wavelength so short that it operated at centimetric frequencies, far shorter than the decimeter wavelengths on which the Metox relied. The new system was designated ASV Mark III, and it represented a leap in technology that had taken years of patient development. The cavity magnetron, a small vacuum tube of extraordinary sophistication, made centimetric radar possible, and the race to produce it in sufficient numbers to equip Coastal Command aircraft had consumed resources and effort across the entire British scientific establishment. Testing had been conducted in strict secrecy, with only the most senior officers and scientists cleared to know of the breakthrough. When the decision came to deploy the Mark III operationally, it was accompanied by security protocols of absolute rigor. The fear that the Germans would discover the wavelength and begin building receivers capable of detecting it drove every precaution. For several weeks in the early spring, the new radar went to war armed with perfect invisibility. The Metox receiver could not detect it because the Metox was built on different principles entirely, optimized for the emissions that aircraft had been transmitting for months. It was as if the British had suddenly begun speaking an entirely different language, and the Germans had brought dictionaries that translated only the old tongue. The first kills, confirmed with confidence to have come from the centimetric radar, were recorded in March of 1943, though the full picture was not immediately clear to the German command. A U-boat would disappear, another would be damaged, forced to limp back to base with unexplained damage. The crews reported aircraft attacks that seemed to come from darkness absolute, with no warning at all, no indication on the METOX receiver that danger was approaching, until the moment the searchlight beam cut through the rain and the depth charges were already falling. Kapitänleutnant Peter Kramer, commanding the U-283, experienced an attack in the bay that left him bewildered and badly shaken. His boat had detected nothing with the METOX. His lookouts had seen nothing in the darkness. The aircraft had simply appeared, firing before there was any possibility of diving. Kramer survived that encounter, but countless others did not, and with each loss, the pressure mounted inside the U-boat arm to understand what was happening. The wolf packs had conquered the Atlantic through knowledge and surprise. The METOX had given them a measure of control, a window into the electronic environment that surrounded them. Now that window had slammed shut, and they were flying blind again. Inside the headquarters of the Befehlshaber der Unterseeboote, the command of U-boats, in Berlin, Admiral Karl Dönitz and his staff confronted a nightmare scenario. The losses were climbing again after the brief respite that the METOX had offered. U-boat crews who had begun to believe that the night transit of the bay might be survivable were dying in unprecedented numbers. The intelligence staff combed through reports, cross-referenced schedules, examined every possible angle of security. They found nothing. No evidence of a spy. No indication of a breach in the Enigma code, though in reality, of course, the Allies had broken that code and were reading German naval traffic with remarkable fluency. But that particular secret remained intact, hidden behind the deception operations of Bletchley Park. What the German intelligence officers could not conceive of was that their enemies had leapfrogged them entirely in radar development. The idea that new radar technology could be deployed without warning, operating on wavelengths that German receivers were not equipped to detect, seemed almost fantastical. Yet it was precisely what had happened. The centimetric radar represented not an incremental advance but a generational leap, a shift in the electronic warfare competition that invalidated months of German development and deployed countersystems. The moment of realization came gradually, then suddenly. By mid-1943, enough U-boats had been lost under circumstances that defied explanation that the German command was forced to consider the possibility that something fundamental had changed in the technological balance. Signals intelligence, the careful analysis of British radio traffic, and the reconstruction of British operations from intercepts began to hint at the deployment of something new, something the METOX could not handle. More troubling still was the intelligence, gathered from interrogated aircrew shot down over Germany and from signals intercepts, that the British were developing centimetric radar systems. The pieces began to fit together, and the picture that emerged was grim. The METOX was obsolete. The technological advantage that it had conferred, so brief, so hard-won through months of development, was gone. The Germans had been given a window into the future, and the future had already closed behind them. What followed was something approaching panic within the senior ranks of the U-boat arm. Dönitz himself was forced to confront the reality that the electronic environment over the Bay of Biscay had turned decisively against him, and that without a new counter-system, without some way to detect centimetric radar, the bay would become a death trap. The human cost of this technological leap manifested in ways that statistics alone could never capture. U-boat crews crossing the bay in April and May of 1943 understood that something had changed, though they could not quite articulate what. The METOX receivers in their boats continued to function, continued to receive no warnings, continued to provide exactly zero information about the dangers that surrounded them. Officers began to order more frequent diving, more elaborate evasion tactics, anything to break the pattern of sudden attacks from invisible aircraft. But caution in a submarine is a luxury that only exists within narrow boundaries. Dive too often, and the boat slows. Dive for too long, and battery power becomes a desperate question. The U-boat forces were trapped between two imperatives that could not both be satisfied: the need for speed to transit the bay, and the need for safety to avoid aircraft, a dilemma that no tactic or weapon could fully resolve. The crews knew, with the clarity that comes from watching friends disappear, that they were expendable. The officers knew that they were being asked to accomplish something that was becoming mathematically impossible. The faith in ultimate victory, the arrogance that had characterized the early years of the Wolfpack offensive, began to corrode. What made the centimetric radar so devastating was not merely that it worked, but that it worked so reliably and so completely that German counterintelligence initially refused to believe it could be radar at all. The patterns were too clean. The kills were too consistent. Radar, in the German understanding, was a blunt instrument. It gave ranges and bearings, but with considerable margins of error, and it required visual confirmation of targets. The aircraft appearing in the darkness over the bay seemed to be using some other method, something more akin to intuition or perfect intelligence. German scientists proposed theories. Perhaps the British had a spy network reporting U-boat movements. Perhaps they were using some form of direction finding on German transmissions. Perhaps there was a fundamental flaw in the METOX design that they had not yet discovered. Theories multiplied because the alternative, that the British had achieved a technological breakthrough so comprehensive that it rendered German countersystems useless, seemed almost too great a defeat to contemplate. Yet it was the truth. The centimetric ASV Mark III represented exactly that, a clean technological victory, a moment when one side had achieved such a decisive advantage in one dimension of warfare that the other side had no answer ready-made. The Coastal Command crews who operated the new radar, of course, understood what they had been given. The feeling was close to euphoria, though it was tempered by the growing danger of flying low-level attacks against U-boats that were now armed with heavy anti-aircraft guns and willing to fight. The operators working the radar sets, hunched over their scopes in the fuselage of Wellingtons and Liberators, saw the picture developing on their screens with a clarity that earlier radar operators could scarcely have imagined. The centimetric wavelength allowed for far greater precision, far better discrimination of small targets, far more reliable detection of surfaced submarines at ranges where the aircraft had the time to maneuver and plan an attack. What had been a percentage game, the odds of finding a submarine in the vastness of the bay, of having the geometry work out in the aircraft's favor, became something closer to a certainty. Once a U-boat was detected, once the search had yielded a contact, the aircraft had every advantage until the moment that the crew chose to press home the attack. And in the spring of 1943, the pilots and captains of Coastal Command were pressing home attacks with ferocity and courage that few had possessed when the odds were less favorable. The strategic implications reverberated upward through the chain of command with terrible clarity. If the Germans could not defeat the new radar, if no counter-system existed, and none was likely to be produced in a time frame that could influence the campaign, then the Bay of Biscay was lost to them. Not militarily, the U-boats were not defeated in any conventional sense, but operationally, as a corridor through which they could move with any reasonable expectation of survival. The losses began to accelerate in April. In May, they became catastrophic. U-boats that could have crossed the bay with survival rates of 40 or 50% just weeks earlier were now facing odds so bad that the survival rate fell toward zero. Dönitz was forced to confront the question that every commander dreads. At what point do the losses become so great that continuing the operation becomes not just militarily unwise, but morally indefensible? The answer was approaching rapidly, though not yet fully in focus. What was in focus was the terrible present moment. Boats lost without explanation, crews dead for reasons they could never fully understand, and a technological enemy that had moved beyond the reach of any response the Germans could mount. The introduction of centimetric radar marked the moment when the electronic warfare dimension of the Bay campaign shifted from being a battle of near equals, each side developing counters and counter-counters, into a situation where one side held decisive advantage. The METOX had prolonged the debate, had made it possible to argue that German ingenuity could keep pace with British scientific innovation. The centimetric radar ended that argument. It did not end the campaign. The U-boats would continue to press through the bay, would continue to suffer losses, would continue to seek adaptations. But it ended the debate about whether the bay could remain a viable operational theatre. The fate of the U-boat arm, the fate of the Atlantic campaign, was now written in mathematics and physics. It was written in the wavelengths of radar beams crossing empty water in darkness, beams that the enemy could not hear, beams that brought death to men who never saw it coming. The losses would continue to mount. The panic in the German command structure would deepen, and by the end of May, the pressure would become so great that Admiral Dönitz would be forced to make a decision that spelled strategic defeat, the withdrawal of the Wolfpacks from the North Atlantic convoy routes, and the effective end of Germany's hopes to starve Britain into submission through submarine warfare. In the technical manuals and the war diaries, the centimetric ASV Mark III would be recorded as one of several factors that contributed to the defeat of the U-boat arm. It would be listed alongside escort improvements, convoy tactics, and the growing coordination between air and sea forces. But for the men in the U-boats, for the crews who did not come home from patrols in the spring and early summer of 1943, the new radar was not one factor among many. It was the invisible killer that had no warning, no counter, no defense. It was the future arriving without announcement, rendering all their training and all their courage and all their faith in German technical superiority meaningless against an enemy that had simply stepped ahead, leaving them to catch up to a standard they could not reach. The centimetric radar was the moment when the Battle of the Atlantic began its long descent from campaign toward disaster, when the mathematics began to favor the defense so decisively that nothing the U-boat arm could do would change the fundamental trajectory. The Germans did not yet know it with complete certainty, but the men in the boats, the men who died in the darkness of the bay, they understood it in their bones. They were facing something they could not fight, something they could not see, something that had already decided their fate before they even left port. For weeks, the signals coming into U-boat command had carried the same dark arithmetic. A boat departed. Days passed. No acknowledgement, no position report, no contact. Then silence. The particular kind of silence that Admiral Karl Dönitz and his staff had learned to read like a sentence. By the opening days of May 1943, that silence was arriving, with a frequency that no operational framework could absorb. The men who plotted positions on the wall charts at Lorient were moving markers from the active column to the lost column, with a regularity that felt less like war accounting and more like a slow, systematic erasure. Something had changed in the Atlantic. The question burning inside the German command was whether they could afford to discover exactly what. The month of May 1943 did not announce itself as the breaking point. It arrived, as catastrophes often do, looking like an extension of what had come before. The Wolfpacks were still at sea. The convoy routes were still being worked. The operational vocabulary of the German submarine arm, patrol grids, attack groups, rendezvous coordinates, remained intact, and on the surface, the machinery appeared to be functioning. But beneath that surface, the losses were compounding faster than replacement boats and replacement crews could cover them. In the first week alone, reports filtered back, indicating contacts broken off, escorts counterattacking with new effectiveness, aircraft appearing where aircraft had no business appearing in the middle of an ocean that should have offered at least the protection of distance. The rhythm of the Wolfpack, that carefully rehearsed cycle of gathering, attacking, and withdrawing, was stuttering. Dönitz had built the Wolfpack doctrine on a simple and elegant logic. Single U-boats hunting alone were vulnerable. Many U-boats hunting together could overwhelm any escort screen, exhaust any defending force, and drive through to the merchant ships at the heart of a convoy. The early successes of the war, those extraordinary tallies of tonnage sunk that had defined the first years of the Atlantic campaign, had seemed to confirm this logic completely. But logic is only as durable as the conditions in which it was formed, and the conditions had been changing, through radar, through air power, through the gradual, painful accumulation of Allied competence, for longer than the German command had wanted to admit. By May 1943, the gap between Dönitz's doctrine and the reality facing his crews had become unmeasurable. The Wolfpacks were not failing occasionally, they were failing structurally. The convoy battles of that month became the evidence that could not be argued away. Across the North Atlantic, groups of U-boats assembled against convoy after convoy and found themselves not hunting but hunted, harassed by aircraft from above and driven down by surface escorts below, unable to close to firing range before being forced deep, short of air, burning through battery power, surfacing into waiting patterns of attack. The Allies had learned, through bitter experience and operational research, how to make the sea around a convoy into a space where a U-boat was always in danger. For the men inside those pressure hulls, hours of diving and running, the temperature rising, the air growing thick, the instruments reporting depth charges close enough to crack fittings and flicker lights, this was no longer a campaign of predatory confidence. It had become something endurance and fear. The Bay of Biscay was extracting its own share of the toll. The patrols flooding the transit zone with aircraft, Sunderlands, Liberators, Wellingtons armed with the new centimetric radar that the Metox receiver could not sense, were finding boats that believed themselves invisible and proving them wrong. A U-boat departing a French port to join the Atlantic campaign now faced the bay crossing as an ordeal in itself, before it had even reached the convoy routes. The losses accumulating in the bay were not simply numbers abstracted from the wider campaign. They were patrol-ready boats, trained crews, and months of preparation, all consumed before they could be used. Each boat lost in transit was a double subtraction from Dönitz's effective strength, gone from the present operation and gone from the force he needed to mount future ones. The bay had become a toll road where the toll was survival. The numbers that reached Dönitz through May were unlike anything the U-boat arm had experienced. Across all theaters of the Atlantic campaign, losses mounted through the month to a figure he himself would later describe in terms that left no room for euphemism. More than 40 boats lost in a single month, not damaged, not forced to abort, lost, disappeared into the cold water of the Atlantic and the Bay with their crews and their potential and the years of training invested in every man. At any point in the first years of the war, losing a handful of boats in a month had been considered acceptable against the tonnage being sunk. By May 1943, the ratio had inverted so completely that the arithmetic of the campaign no longer supported continuation on its current terms. The U-boat arm was consuming itself. In the Allied operational centres, in Liverpool and Plymouth, and the air station dispersals where coastal command crews waited between patrols, the intelligence picture was being assembled piece by piece from intercepts, sighting reports, and the expanding confirmation of kills. There was no single moment of revelation. Instead, there was a gradual recognition, building through the month, that the numbers were moving in a way they had never quite moved before. Aircraft crews landing after night patrols, men who had spent months flying enormous, empty stretches of ocean and finding nothing, were now returning with attacks confirmed, with wreckage spotted, with the oily dark circles on grey water that marked where a U-boat had been. The bay was no longer a free transit corridor. It was demonstrably, measurably dangerous for the enemy. For the German crews attempting the bay crossing in May, the experience had taken on a quality of dread. The transit that had once been routine, unpleasant, claustrophobic, but survivable, had been transformed into a gauntlet with no clear safe passage. A boat might make it through. Many had, and continued to. But the knowledge that the aircraft overhead might be carrying radar that no instrument on board could warn against, that the next attack might arrive without the 3-minute warning the Metox had once provided, changed the psychological texture of every hour at sea. Men who had entered the U-boat arm in years of confidence and early success were now making transits in which silence from headquarters meant safety, and any radio contact might be the last. The culture of the arm was being rewritten, one lost boat at a time. Dönitz reached his decision in the third week of May 1943. The wolf packs would be withdrawn from the main North Atlantic convoy routes. This was not framed publicly as a retreat, and the German command invested considerable effort in presenting it as a tactical redeployment to less heavily defended areas where the campaign might be resumed under more favorable conditions. But Dönitz understood precisely what it was. Writing in his own records, he did not hide from the mathematics. His boats could not continue to sustain losses at this rate and remain a coherent fighting force. To persist on the same routes against the same improved defenses was not strategy. It was the systematic destruction of his own arm. The withdrawal was an admission of strategic defeat, the first and most consequential turning point in the longest campaign of the war. The decision reverberated immediately through the entire structure of the Allied war effort. For more than 3 years, the Battle of the Atlantic had pressed against every other strategic priority, limiting where and when operations could be launched, dictating the pace at which men and material could cross the ocean, casting its arithmetic over every planning meeting at the highest levels of Allied command. Churchill's private admissions of fear about the U-boat threat had not been rhetorical. They had reflected the real fragility of a war effort that depended on the safe passage of millions of tons of shipping per month. When Dönitz pulled the wolf packs back, the weight of that anxiety did not vanish immediately. U-boats remained dangerous, the bay remained contested, and new weapons were already being prepared on the German side. But the existential pressure that had defined Allied strategic thinking since 1940 lifted, however partially, for the first time. In the immediate aftermath, among the men who had fought to bring about this moment, the reaction was not triumph, it was closer to exhaustion. Coastal Command crews who had flown thousands of hours over grey, featureless water, many of them losing friends to the weather and the mechanical demands of those aircraft as much as to enemy action, had pressed the Bay offensive through months when the kill rate was low and the sense of futility was real. The sailors of the escort groups, who had spent convoy after convoy running down contacts and listening to the sound of merchant ships dying in the darkness, did not celebrate the withdrawal as a victory parade. They understood it as the result of attrition, of endurance pressed against endurance, and they felt it in their bones. Some had barely slept for months. Some had not been home in longer than that. The war was not over. The bay was still dangerous. But something had broken that would not be repaired. What broke in May 1943 was not simply German offensive capacity in the Atlantic. It was the conceptual foundation on which the U-boat campaign had rested since its earliest and most lethal phase. The Wolfpack had been Dönitz's instrument and his identity, the concentrated, coordinated expression of a doctrine he had spent years developing and defending. In May 1943, the Atlantic demonstrated that the instrument had met its match, and that the match had been made in the grey triangle of the Bay of Biscay as much as anywhere else. The boats that never cleared the French coast, the boats found by centimetric radar in the middle of the night watch, the boats that crossed the bay and were destroyed before they ever joined a patrol group, those losses had hollowed out the wolf packs before they formed. The bay had done what its most determined Allied advocates had argued it could do. It had made the transit a campaign in itself, and in May 1943, that campaign reached its first devastating verdict. The catastrophe of May 1943 had left scars across the German naval command. Replacements were being trained, however hastily, and Dönitz, a man whose entire professional identity was bound up in the aggressive prosecution of the war at sea, could not accept permanent defeat in the waters between France and Britain. In the summer of 1943, even as the catastrophe in the Atlantic was still echoing through his headquarters, the admiral began plotting his recovery. The cornerstone of that recovery would be technological. The problem, Dönitz and his staff understood with growing clarity, was that the Metox warning receiver had become useless. Coastal Command's new radar, the Mark III with its centimetric wavelength, operated on a frequency that Metox simply could not detect. The boats were dying without warning, without understanding why their enemy had gained such overwhelming advantage. German intelligence, working with the signals branch, had already begun to suspect the nature of the problem. The British were using a new radar operating on a shorter wavelength, one that penetrated the traditional defenses. What was needed was a new detection device, something that could warn a U-boat captain of centimetric radar sweeping toward him before the bomb-laden aircraft arrived out of the murk and rain. The answer came from the German signals laboratories. In the summer of 1943, the first prototype of the Naxos radar warning receiver was delivered to the U-boat command. Unlike Metox, which was a passive listening device monitoring enemy radar transmissions, Naxos represented a new leap in sophistication. The device was designed to detect not just the presence of centimetric radar, but the precise direction and bearing from which the radar signals were emanating. For a U-boat captain on the surface at night, crossing the bay with his diesel engines pounding, this information was invaluable. If Naxos could paint a picture of where the enemy aircraft was transmitting from, then a quick dive in the right direction might mean the difference between escape and being pinned by a Wellington bomber's lee light and depth charges. Dönitz saw in Naxos a pathway back to viability. The first Naxos-equipped U-boats began transiting the bay in August 1943. They moved cautiously at first, crews learning the feel of the new device, mastering the interpretation of its dials and indicators. The results were immediate and encouraging. Several boats reported successful detector activations, moments when Naxos had warned them of approaching aircraft, allowing them time to dive before visual contact was made. For the first time in months, the curve of U-boat losses in the bay began to flatten slightly. Where Coastal Command had been achieving kill rates of better than one submarine sunk per 1,000 flying hours in June and July, the figures edged downward. The effect was not dramatic enough to spark alarm in the British command, but it was noticeable. The momentum had shifted, even slightly. Dönitz seized on these early successes as vindication. He ordered more boats through the bay. He promised his captains that new technology would protect them. The U-boat arm, beaten but not broken, was attempting to reassert itself, but Coastal Command was not standing still. Air Marshal John Slessor's headquarters had already begun to anticipate that the Germans would develop another countermeasure. The operational research team that had reshaped the Bay offensive in the spring continued its analytical work throughout the summer. When intelligence reports suggested the introduction of a new warning receiver, codenamed Naxos by the Allies, though its German designation was Fu Mei III, the question became immediately tactical. How could Coastal Command negate this new threat? The answer, as always, lay in change. Change frequency, change transmission patterns, change altitude, change approach vectors, make the enemy's new countermeasure obsolete almost before it could be properly understood. The first Allied response was to vary the radar transmission patterns and frequencies. Instead of operating Mark III in a single, fixed mode that Naxos could learn to detect, crews were ordered to shift between several transmission patterns, altering frequency bands and pulse rates at irregular intervals. This made it harder for Naxos to lock onto a consistent signal. Some crews were ordered to climb to higher altitudes and transmit from above, making it difficult for a surfaced U-boat to use Naxos direction finding to determine a precise vector of escape. Others were instructed to approach from unexpected angles, using the radar initially at extreme range, and then shutting it down during the final stages of an attack run, depriving the U-boat of warning just when it was most needed. These were not revolutionary tactics, but they were effective. They introduced uncertainty, They forced U-boat captains to second-guess the information their Naxos receivers were giving them. Some boats dove when Naxos showed a contact that turned out to be a false return. Others held position, thinking a nearby transmission was too far away to be dangerous, only to be caught by aircraft approaching from an unexpected quadrant. By September 1943, an eerie pattern had settled over the Bay of Biscay. Neither side possessed a decisive technical advantage. Instead, there existed a grinding stalemate of innovation and counter-innovation, played out against the backdrop of grey skies, grey water, and unrelenting time. A coastal command crew flying a patrol would approach a suspected U-boat contact with Mark III radar, uncertain whether the boat's Naxos would detect them. They might change altitude 3 times during a single approach run, forcing the aircraft to climb and dive through cloud, losing altitude, burning fuel, all to defeat a device they could not even see. Below, a U-boat captain received Naxos warnings, but he could never be certain whether the warning represented a genuine threat or a phantom signal, whether the aircraft was actually bearing down or passing miles away. The pressure on both sides was constant and deadening. The human cost of this grinding phase was distinct from the high drama of the spring crisis, but no less corrosive. For coastal command aircrews, uncertainty bred a different kind of danger. A Halifax or Wellington approaching a suspected contact could no longer assume that a surfaced U-boat would simply dive. If the captain thought his Naxos had deceived him, or if he judged the aircraft's approach too sudden to risk a dive, he might stay on the surface and fight. Coastal command crews had learned to respect the flak from U-boats. A 20mm anti-aircraft gun, manned by an experienced gunner aboard a submarine, could shred an aircraft's fuselage. Pilots learned to approach from unexpected angles, at different speeds, sometimes diving steeply to confuse a U-boat's gun crews. The British aircraft carried more armor, more guns, but a direct hit from a U-boat's flak could still be lethal. Over the course of the autumn of 1943, several coastal command aircraft were lost, not to bombs or depth charges, but to accurate U-boat flak. Each loss represented a crew of 7 or 8 men, trained over months or years, lost to the grinding attrition of the campaign. For U-boat crews, the uncertainty took a different form. They were trapped in their boats, living in an atmosphere of tension that never fully released. Some captains adopted aggressive stances, preferring to fight on the surface and rely on flak to drive away aircraft. Others were more cautious, preferring to trust their new Naxos receivers and taking every warning as a signal to dive, regardless of fuel expenditure or navigational risk. Seasickness, mechanical failures, simple exhaustion, all of these remained constant companions during the days-long transit of the bay. A boat might lose its Naxos receiver to a technical malfunction partway across, leaving the captain blind and forced to rely on human lookouts and instinct. The psychological pressure was immense. The bay was no longer the free highway it had been. It was no longer even the killing ground it had been in May. It had become something worse, a realm of perpetual uncertainty, where every contact might be nothing or might be the end of everything. The pattern of losses in the bay during this phase reflected this new equilibrium. September 1943 saw the loss of a handful of U-boats, but not at the catastrophic rate of May. October and November were similar. A coastal command patrol would occasionally achieve a kill, sometimes after several attacks and hours of maneuvering. A U-boat might successfully transit the bay, battered by near misses and stress, only to sink weeks later in the Atlantic. The kill rate per patrol hour climbed back to pre-May levels, roughly 1 submarine for every 2,000 hours of flying time. This was not the devastating efficiency Coastal Command had achieved in the spring, but it remained lethal. Over the course of the second half of 1943, perhaps 15 to 18 U-boats were lost in the bay and its approaches. Dernitz's recovery was real, but it remained incomplete. The boats were transiting again, but only in small numbers and at terrible cost. Both sides understood that this deadlock was temporary. The Germans knew they needed another technological leap. Naxos had bought them time but not triumph. There were rumors of new submarines with improved capabilities, boats with stronger anti-aircraft armament, vessels fitted with acoustic homing torpedoes that could strike back at escorting warships. In British headquarters, the acceptance grew that the centimetric radar advantage would not remain permanent. Enemy scientists were clever, and German technical capability was not negligible. Schlesser's command began developing new patrol tactics for the day when Naxos would inevitably be followed by some new defensive system. The effort was exhausting for both the Luftwaffe and the Navy. Watching the slow grind of technical competition in the skies and seas of the bay was an exercise in frustration. Neither side could achieve decisive breakthrough. Each innovation was met with counter-innovation. Each tactical adjustment was met with tactical response. The grinding attrition of the autumn and early winter of 1943 established a pattern that would characterize the remainder of the Bay campaign. The large, sudden, violent turning points, the kind that had marked the previous phases, would become rarer. Instead, there would be longer periods of contested ambiguity, where superiority swung incrementally based on which side had most recently adapted its technology or tactics. Aircraft would be lost, boats would be sunk, but the margins would be measured in small percentages rather than dramatic shifts. For the men flying and fighting in this unseen war, the pilots pressing home attacks against boats armed with flak guns, the U-boat captains trying to read the intentions of warning devices they could not entirely trust, the exhaustion was profound. They were being asked to fight and die for inches of advantage and degrees of tactical certainty. This was the true face of the Bay of Biscay campaign, as 1943 gave way to 1944. Not triumph, but persistence. Not victory, but survival. By the opening weeks of 1944, the war had changed its shape. The wolf packs that had once ranged across the North Atlantic with terrifying freedom were broken, scattered, and depleted. The catastrophic losses of the previous year had not destroyed the U-boat arm. Dönitz was still building boats, still training crews, still pushing steel into the water, but the arm had been fundamentally weakened, and every commander on both sides understood it. What neither side could yet say with certainty was when, and where, the blow that would decide the war in the West would fall. The Allies knew, the Germans suspected, and the Bay of Biscay, that grey and restless stretch of water between the French coast and the open Atlantic, was about to acquire a new and overwhelming strategic meaning. The Allied planners working on what would become Operation Overlord could not afford ambiguity. The invasion of northern France would require the largest amphibious armada ever assembled, tens of thousands of men, thousands of vehicles, millions of tons of equipment moving across the English Channel in a window of weather and tide that could not be extended and could not be repeated. Every calculation they made rested on one foundational assumption: the sea lanes through which that armada would pass had to be defended. The western approaches had to be held, and to hold them, the Bay of Biscay had to be made so lethally dangerous that no meaningful concentration of U-boats could survive long enough to reach the channel and attack the invasion fleet. The Bay offensive was no longer simply a campaign to strangle German submarine operations. It had become the outer shield of the greatest military operation in history. Coastal Command received its new mandate with something between relief and grim determination. For years, the command had fought its battles with inadequate aircraft, inadequate weapons, and inadequate support from an air ministry that never fully accepted the maritime war as worthy of its best resources. Now the resources came, and they came in earnest. Liberators, Sunderlands, Halifaxes, and Wellingtons, many now fitted with the centimetric ASV Mark III radar that the Germans still could not reliably detect, flooded the patrol lines across the bay in concentrations that dwarfed anything attempted in 1943. The patrol schedules were structured with a precision that owed as much to mathematics as to airmanship, shaped by the operational researchers who had spent years counting contacts and calculating probabilities. The objective was not merely to sink U-boats, it was to make the transit so costly that Dönitz would exhaust his arm simply trying to reach the hunting grounds. The Royal Navy's surface forces tightened the net from below. Support groups, those mobile, independent hunter-killer formations that had proved their value through the previous year, were concentrated in the western approaches and the bay itself. Captain Frederick Walker's second support group remained among the most formidable of these formations, its ships working in practiced coordination with the aircraft above them, a combined killing machine that had been honed through months of brutal experience. The doctrine was now well understood on both sides. Aircraft would find and harry the U-boats, forcing them to the surface or holding them submerged until their batteries failed, and surface warships would close in to deliver the kill. The layered defense that had taken years of costly experiment to build was now operating at its most lethal efficiency, timed precisely to the invasion's approaching deadline. Dönitz understood the arithmetic as well as anyone. He knew his boats were bleeding away in the bay, and he knew why, though the full picture of Allied technological advantage remained stubbornly opaque to his intelligence staff. What he could not do was accept inaction. If the Allies landed in France and established a firm beachhead, the war in the West was effectively decided. His submarines, whatever remained of them, had to be committed against the invasion fleet, regardless of the cost of getting them there. Through the spring of 1944, he pressed his commanders and his crews to attempt the transit with renewed urgency, accepting that losses would be severe and gambling that some sufficient number of boats would break through to make the sacrifice worthwhile. It was the logic of a man who had already conceded the middle game and was playing for a miracle in the end game. The boats that attempted the bay transit in those spring months found conditions that their predecessors, from even a year earlier, would have recognized as transformed, almost beyond comprehension. The schnorkel, that retractable air-breathing mast that allowed a U-boat to run its diesel engines while submerged, had begun to appear on operational boats, and those equipped with it had a genuine, if partial, protection against detection. But not all boats had schnorkels fitted in time, and those that crossed on the surface, or used the device imperfectly, faced air patrols of a density and persistence that made the transit an exercise in controlled terror. Aircraft appeared from directions the crew had not expected, at times the watch officers had not predicted, guided by radar emissions that the latest German warning receivers could still not always intercept with reliable consistency. The bay felt, to the men crossing it, like a body of water that had decided to kill them. Losses mounted through the first months of the year in patterns that confirmed the Allied approach was working. Boats that sortied from Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, and the other Biscay bases were tracked by patrol aircraft almost from the moment they cleared the harbour approaches. Some were caught on the surface within hours, others made it further into the bay before a circling Sunderland or a Liberator from a distant Cornish airfield found them in darkness through the cold eye of centimetric radar. The surface groups waited at the edges of the air patrol zones, ready to sweep in when a contact was established and an aircraft's fuel or ordnance was exhausted. It was a system designed to give the U-boat crew no rest and no safe interval, no moment when they could be certain the sky and the sea were empty and hostile attention had moved elsewhere. When the 6th of June 1944 finally arrived and the Armada crossed the channel in the grey hours before first light, the U-boat response that Dönitz had planned was already gutted before it began. He ordered every available boat toward the invasion area. Boats surged from their Biscay bases in numbers that, under any earlier conditions of the war, might have represented a serious threat. But the bay, by this point, was not the transit corridor it had once been. It was a gauntlet. Allied air and sea patrols had been further reinforced in the days before the landing, operating on intelligence that indicated a major German movement was imminent. Aircraft flew continuous barriers across the probable approach routes. Surface groups patrolled the gaps. The boats that attempted passage were met with a response so immediate and so comprehensive that most were either sunk, damaged and forced back, or pinned in positions far too distant to threaten the invasion fleet in any meaningful time frame. The boats that did reach the channel found the environment there scarcely more forgiving. The shallow, congested waters of the English Channel were not U-boat country under any conditions, but in June of 1944 they were patrolled at an intensity that reduced the operational life expectancy of any submerged boat to days or less. Anti-submarine aircraft worked in concert with surface escorts along every probable approach route, and the density of Allied shipping, rather than representing opportunity, created an acoustic and visual environment in which concealment was nearly impossible. The boats that managed to attack did so at extreme risk, and the damage they inflicted, while real enough to the crews and ships caught by torpedoes, was utterly insignificant in relation to the scale of the invasion and the volume of traffic flowing across the channel. The threat Dönitz had wagered so much to create never materialized. The cost to the U-boat arm of those desperate weeks was savage and disproportionate. Boats were lost in the bay, in the approaches, in the channel itself, in a procession of engagements that left Dönitz's Atlantic strength visibly diminished with every week that passed. The crews that went out in those months knew, with a clarity that required no official briefing, what their statistical chances of survival were. Morale among German submariners had not collapsed. There are no reliable accounts of mass refusals or open mutiny, but the letters that surviving men wrote and the testimonies they gave after the war carry a consistent undertone of resignation that is different in quality from the confidence, even the arrogance, that had characterized the arm in its early years. They went because they were ordered to go, and because the culture of their service demanded it of them, and because some part of each man still calculated that he might be among the ones who came back. The Allied air crews and sailors pressing those attacks carried their own burden. Anti-submarine work remained grinding, exhausting, and statistically unlikely to produce results on any given patrol. The hours spent flying over empty grey water, scanning a radar screen that showed nothing, waiting for a contact that never came, these constituted the vast majority of the working lives of Coastal Command crews in the bay. When contacts did come, they came fast and dangerous, often against boats now equipped with heavy anti-aircraft armament that could put up a serious fight before diving or being overwhelmed. Men died on both sides in these engagements, in burning aircraft losing altitude over cold Atlantic water, in damaged U-boats fighting their last minutes on the surface, in warships struck by acoustic torpedoes that found their propellers through the noise of the sea. The Bay of Biscay in 1944 was no less deadly for being a campaign that was, in strategic terms, already decided. What the spring and early summer of 1944 confirmed, conclusively and at great human cost on both sides, was that the Bay of Biscay had been transformed from a German highway into an Allied killing ground. It had taken nearly 4 years of technological struggle, institutional argument, operational research, and sustained aerial and naval campaign to achieve that transformation. The men who had built it, the air crews who flew the early inadequate patrols, the scientists who developed the radar, the planners who structured the offensive, the sailors who ran down the contacts, had created the conditions under which the greatest seaborne operation in history could cross the channel without being torn apart beneath the waves. The Bay campaign never produced the clean, dramatic climax that military history tends to celebrate. It produced something rarer and more important, a war of attrition, fought to a definitive strategic conclusion, quietly, in grey water and grey sky, by men whose names the headlines seldom carried. In the autumn of 1943, as the Bay of Biscay had transformed from a highway into a gauntlet, the German Naval High Command faced a crisis that no amount of courage or tactical audacity could solve. The centimetric radar that had blindsided Dönitz's submarine arm in the spring still haunted every U-boat commander who dared to surface for transit. Aircraft appeared from cloud banks without warning. Escorts materialized from darkness, and by the time a lookout's voice cracked over the voice pipe, it was often too late. The losses continued to mount, not catastrophic, but steady and relentless, a slow bleeding that drained resources and morale alike. In the engineering depots and design bureaus of Germany, a solution had been quietly developing, a device so ingenious and so fundamentally transformative that it would reshape not just the Bay campaign, but the entire character of submarine warfare itself. That device was the Schnorkel. The story of the Schnorkel begins not in 1943, but much earlier, in the Swedish Navy of the 1930s, where engineers had experimented with a retractable air-breathing tube that would allow a submarine to draw fresh air while remaining submerged. The concept was elegant in its simplicity, a hollow mast fitted with a valve at the top, which could be raised when the boat was near the surface, drawing in air for the diesel engines, while the hull remained below the waves. For the British Admiralty and the Air Ministry, radar had been the weapon that forced U-boats to transit the bay on the surface, vulnerable and exposed. For the German Navy, the Schnorkel was the answer, a means of returning to the undersea world, to disappear from the eyes of those who hunted from above. The technical details matter because they speak to the desperation and ingenuity of the German response. A Schnorkel tube, roughly 4 inches in diameter, extended upward from the submarine's pressure hull and could be telescoped up or down as needed. At its head sat a float valve, a simple mechanism that would close automatically if seawater tried to rise more than a few centimeters into the tube, protecting the diesel engines from flooding. When raised while the boat traveled at shallow depth, it allowed the engines to breathe, drawing in fresh air from the surface, while the submarine itself remained below the radar horizon. To the naked eye, a Schnorkel would be invisible. To radar searching for the distinctive return of a surfaced hull, it presented almost nothing, a thin metal tube no thicker than a chimney, rising barely above the waterline. The first U-boats to be fitted with Schnorkels were Type Foik submarines, the workhorses of the German fleet, modified in German shipyards and at the bases in France. By late 1943 and into 1944, the retrofitting program accelerated. U-boats that had once been forced to choose between surfacing to recharge batteries or remaining submerged in blind darkness now had a third option: run silent, run deep, but keep the engines running. The implications were immediately apparent to the officers and men who understood submarine warfare. Coastal Command pilots, who had grown accustomed to hunting surfaced submarines, realized, with a quiet kind of dread, that their prey was vanishing. Patrols over the bay that had once produced regular sightings now yielded nothing but grey water and empty sky. A U-boat fitted with a Schnorkel could transit the bay almost invisible, detectable only if an aircraft happened to pass close enough to spot the thin, foam-traced wake left by the tube itself, or if a submarine became so careless as to raise its periscope. The technological balance that had been won through months of struggle and cost was suddenly, inexplicably, shifting again. Yet the Schnorkel brought with it a terrible paradox. Invisibility came at the price of misery. To understand what the Schnorkel truly meant for the men inside the steel hulls, one must imagine the experience of submerged transit for hours at a time, running on diesel engines while the boat remained under the surface. The air inside a U-boat during normal submerged operations was always poor, thick with humidity, stale with the breath of 60 men packed into a space smaller than a city apartment. But with a Schnorkel, the diesel engines were running, consuming oxygen at a voracious rate, while the fresh air intake was restricted to whatever narrow breath the tube could provide. The air inside became foul beyond description. Carbon dioxide accumulated, oxygen saturation dropped. Men reported a sensation like breathing through a damp cloth, headaches that built throughout the watch, a pervasive exhaustion that never lifted. In addition, the Schnorkel was mechanically unreliable. The float valve would sometimes jam, sometimes fail to close when seawater sloshed up the tube, flooding the compartments below and forcing an emergency blow of the ballast tanks. Diesel fumes mixed with seawater and human sweat to create an atmosphere that was not merely unpleasant, but actively poisonous in prolonged doses. Submarine crews who had always endured extreme conditions now faced something new, conditions that were worse than anything that had come before, with no immediate relief in sight. The psychological impact was profound. Men who had volunteered for the U-boat arm, who had been trained to accept danger and deprivation as the price of service, now found that the price had increased beyond what the human body could comfortably sustain for extended operations. Yet they had no choice. Orders were orders, and the fatherland demanded that boats get through the bay. The introduction of the schnorkel did have the desired effect. U-boat losses in the bay declined sharply as fewer submarines were caught on the surface in broad daylight. Coastal Command and the Royal Navy found themselves facing an enemy that had largely retreated beneath the waves, visible only in fleeting glimpses and occasionally through luck or precise timing. For the first time since the introduction of centimetric radar, the Allies faced a tactical problem that could not be solved through pure electronics. The schnorkel could not be detected by radar because it presented almost no return signal. It could not be seen from the air unless the observer was looking at exactly the right place at exactly the right moment. The U-boat, in a sense, had regained a measure of its original advantage: invisibility, the fundamental weapon of the submarine. But invisibility came with obligations, and those obligations transformed the nature of the Bay campaign once again. With schnorkels fitted, U-boats could remain submerged throughout their transit, which meant they could not use their periscopes frequently to fix their position by stellar observation or by identifying landmarks. Navigation became extraordinarily difficult. Boats relied on dead reckoning, estimating their position based on compass heading and speed through the water, a method that accumulated error over the hours. U-boat commanders complained that they had no reliable way to know whether they were actually where they thought they were. Some boats became so lost that they drifted off course by dozens of kilometers, only to discover their true position when they finally surfaced well past the danger zone, or, worse, when they realized they were heading directly toward the Devon coast. The combination of navigational uncertainty, mechanical unreliability, and the physical agony of submerged diesel operation created a new form of strain on U-boat crews, less dramatic than being hunted by aircraft, but grinding and relentless in its own way. Coastal Command and the Royal Navy, understanding that radar had become less useful against submerged, schnorkel-equipped boats, adapted their tactics once more. The focus shifted toward acoustic detection, passive listening devices, and, eventually, active sonar, which could hear the characteristic noise of a diesel engine even when the boat was running beneath the surface. The acoustic signature of a U-boat was distinctive: the rhythmic throb of the diesel, the vibration transmitted through the water, the faint grinding of the propeller shaft. British warships and specially equipped aircraft began deploying sonobuoys, small buoyant devices that could be dropped into the water and left floating, each one containing a hydrophone, an underwater microphone, that transmitted sounds back to the aircraft above. A patrol aircraft carrying a string of sonobuoys could blanket a section of the bay and then listen for the telltale acoustic signature of a submerged U-boat. It was not as precise as radar, not as reliable, but it was the only tool available in the new tactical environment. Patrol patterns shifted. Aircraft flew lower, slower, and closer together, trying to maintain continuous acoustic surveillance of the bay's approaches. The advantage swung, slightly and gradually, back toward the hunters. German intelligence, meanwhile, tried to develop a counter to sonobuoys and acoustic detection, but the response was slower and less effective than it had been to earlier Allied innovations. By the time new German detection equipment became operational, Coastal Command had already adapted their sonobuoy patterns and transmission frequencies. The electronic war had entered a new phase, one in which acoustic waves traveled through water instead of electromagnetic pulses through air, but the fundamental logic remained unchanged. Innovation by one side triggered counter-innovation by the other, and neither side could ever completely escape the cycle. The schnorkel, despite all its advantages, never became a complete solution to the problem of transit through the bay. Yes, it made U-boats harder to find and harder to kill. Yes, it reduced losses compared to the catastrophic spring of 1943, but it did not restore the bay to the status of a safe highway that it had been in the early war years. Aircraft still hunted there. Escort vessels still patrolled the depths. The combination of improved acoustic detection, relentless air patrols, and occasional surface engagements meant that U-boats making the transit remained under constant threat, merely less visible threat than before. A U-boat equipped with a schnorkel was safer than one forced to surface, but it was not safe. The statistical reality spoke clearly. U-boats were still being sunk in the bay, still being lost during transit, still failing to reach their patrol positions or return from them. Dernitz's operational records, carefully filed and later captured by the Allies, showed a steady, if reduced, drain on the submarine fleet throughout 1944. The schnorkel had bought time and had reduced the rate of attrition, but it had not ended the fundamental problem. The Bay of Biscay remained a place where German submarines went to die, even if they died more slowly, more quietly, and more invisibly than they had before. The human cost of the schnorkel era was peculiar and difficult to quantify. On one hand, fewer men were killed in the sudden violence of air attacks or in the rapid decompression that came when a depth charge tore open a pressure hull. On the other hand, more men suffered the grinding misery of submerged diesel operation and the nervous exhaustion that came from transiting the bay while running blind, both literally, unable to see through a periscope for extended periods, and metaphorically, lost to dead reckoning navigation. U-boat doctors, writing in their logs, reported cases of what they called seelenpein, a kind of spiritual sickness that emerged from the combination of claustrophobia, sensory deprivation, and constant low-level fear. Men who had been capable of enduring acute danger sometimes found themselves breaking under the chronic strain of days-long submerged transit through hostile waters. Some became paranoid, convinced they could hear Allied search patterns in the ambient noise of the water. Others simply withdrew into themselves, sitting in their bunks and staring at nothing, unable to engage with the crew around them. The schnorkel, that ingenious device born from Swedish engineering and German desperation, had solved one problem but created another. It had not made the bay safer, merely different in the kind of danger it presented. Coastal Command and Royal Navy crews, for their part, found themselves hunting an enemy that was harder to see, harder to track, and sometimes impossible to locate, despite all their equipment and skill. The grinding attrition continued, neither dramatic nor decisive, but relentless in its own way. By 1944, the schnorkel was not a rare sight, but nearly universal among the U-boat fleet attempting transits through the bay. The German shipyards worked systematically through the backlog of boats waiting for conversion. Every available boat that could be fitted with a schnorkel was fitted. Every available commander received training in submerged diesel operations. Every crew endured the trials and tribulations of the new system. The schnorkel represented, in essence, the final major tactical adaptation available to the German submarine arm, facing the improved defenses of the bay. After the schnorkel, there remained only incremental improvements, marginal adjustments to antenna placement and engine configuration, nothing that fundamentally altered the tactical equation. The device itself would outlast the Third Reich. After the war, navies around the world would adopt schnorkel technology, recognizing it as one of the few genuinely innovative German contributions to submarine warfare. Soviet submarines, American submarines, French submarines, all would eventually carry schnorkels into the Cold War and beyond, a legacy of German engineering born from desperation in 1943 and early 1944. What the schnorkel never achieved, despite all its operational advantages, was the reversal of the strategic trend that had been set in motion when the Allies gained effective control of the Bay of Biscay. The U-boats equipped with schnorkels still made their transits. still reached their patrol positions, still conducted their operations against Allied shipping, but they did so in smaller numbers, with greater difficulty, and at higher cost to their crews than ever before. The infrastructure that supported them was crumbling. The German bases in France were becoming untenable as Allied armies advanced eastward. The supply lines that fed the U-boat arm were failing. The training pipeline that produced replacement crews was being overwhelmed by losses faster than it could replenish them. The Schnorkel bought time in the tactical sense. It prolonged the U-boat campaign in the Atlantic and the Bay for months beyond what might have been expected, but it could not buy back the strategic initiative. The war was already being lost in the boardrooms and command posts and manufacturing facilities where such decisions were made. What the Schnorkel could do, and what it did do effectively, was make the price of losing even higher, ensuring that the final chapters of the U-boat war would be written not with sudden catastrophe, but with quiet, grinding attrition, one boat and one crew at a time, disappearing beneath the grey waters of the bay and never returning. The final image of the Schnorkel era is one that still resonates today, a U-boat running submerged through hostile waters, the crew listening to the rhythmic pulse of the diesel engine, the air growing foul and thick, the navigator making his best educated guesses about their position, the commander standing in the control room wondering when they would finally reach the relative safety of the deep Atlantic. Above, in the rain-filled sky, aircraft continued their patrols. Below, escort vessels continued guard. The summer of 1944 arrived with a terrible clarity for the German Navy. The beaches of Normandy, breached on the 6th of June, had triggered a cascade of consequences that rippled westward across occupied France. Within weeks, the carefully balanced strategic map that had made the Bay of Biscay a defined theatre of war began to dissolve. The coastal bases that had spawned U-boats for 4 years, Brest, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, La Pallice, and Bordeaux, were no longer bastions of German power, but increasingly isolated pockets surrounded by advancing Allied ground forces. What had been a maritime battle fought in the air and on the water was about to become something far grimmer, a land siege of fortress ports that refused to yield even as the greater German cause crumbled. The men who crewed these bases faced an impossible choice that summer: abandon the installations and fall back, or die holding them. Most would choose to stay. The U-boat bases, transformed from industrial complexes into military fortresses, would become tombs for thousands of soldiers who would fight on long after any rational hope of victory had vanished. The German garrison commanders understood their position with brutal honesty. To the east, the Allies had broken out of Normandy and were racing toward Germany itself. To the north and west, American and British forces were sweeping through Brittany, cutting off the ports from any hope of relief or retreat. The commanding officers, men like Admiral Karl Donitz's regional commander, received orders from Berlin that were almost surreal in their disconnect from reality. The ports were to be held as fortresses. They were to be defended to the last man. Surrender was not contemplated. The logic, if it could be called that, rested on a single strategic belief. As long as the U-boat bases remained in German hands, there remained a theoretical possibility that submarines could continue to operate, that the war at sea was not entirely lost. But by mid-1944, this was fantasy. The U-boats sheltering in these ports were largely useless. Many were damaged, awaiting repairs that spare parts and manpower could no longer provide. Others were modern boats equipped with the new Schnorkel system, but their crews were exhausted, their prospects grim. Yet the Nazi regime ordered these places held as if they were the last pillars holding up the Third Reich. Lorient became the epitome of this tragic stubbornness. The port, nestled on the coast of Brittany, had been the most prolific U-boat base in France. Hundreds of submarines had transited through its pens, operated from its workshops, been crewed by men who came ashore for brief periods of leave in the surrounding town. By the summer of 1944, Lorient was surrounded. American infantry had reached the outer suburbs. The garrison, consisting of roughly 4,000 naval personnel, German army soldiers, and sailors conscripted into land defense units, prepared for a siege that everyone knew was already lost. The concrete U-boat pens remained intact, massive structures that had survived years of bombing by becoming their own fortifications. But they were now nothing more than shelters for men awaiting an end that could only come in defeat. The harbour was mined and trapped, useless for any legitimate military purpose. Yet Lorient was held. It would be held for nearly a year. Not a single surrender, but a grinding process of attrition as supply lines failed, ammunition dwindled, and men died for reasons no one could clearly articulate anymore. The situation at Saint-Nazaire was even more extraordinary. This port, farther up the Loire estuary, had been equally crucial to the U-boat war. It was defended by roughly 4,000 troops, many of them sailors with no infantry training. They were ringed by American forces, who simply chose to contain them rather than launch a costly frontal assault on the fortified position. Saint-Nazaire would remain a German garrison, cut off from supply, until the very end of the war in Europe. Months would pass. Soldiers would die from wounds that could not be properly treated, from disease born of unsanitary conditions, from hunger as provisions ran short and resupply became impossible. Officers would issue orders to men who understood perfectly well that these orders served no military purpose whatsoever. There was no enemy to stop, no convoy to block, no strategic objective to achieve. There was only the stubborn fact of occupation and the stubborn fact of German refusal to accept reality. The men holding Saint-Nazaire endured not because they believed in victory, but because they believed in obedience, or because escape was impossible, or because the alternative, mutiny, seemed worse than slow erosion under siege conditions. La Pallice, south of the Loire, experienced a similar trajectory. This base had sheltered U-boats, been bombed repeatedly by British air attacks, been rebuilt and reinforced until it too became a fortress. The German commander and his garrison found themselves increasingly isolated as the summer of 1944 progressed. The landscape around the port filled with American positions. Supply trucks could not get through, communication with higher command became sporadic, yet orders to hold firm continued to arrive. Officers watched their men begin to starve slowly, to lack the medicines necessary to treat even minor wounds, to lose hope with each passing week. The U-boats themselves were becoming irrelevant. Any boats attempting to use La Pallice as a base faced the certainty of being sunk or captured. The rational course would have been to scuttle the remaining submarines and withdraw the crews, but this would have constituted a form of surrender, and surrender was forbidden. So the boats sat in their pens, deteriorating, their crews living in conditions of increasing misery while the war moved on. Bordeaux, farthest south, held a smaller German garrison, but it too refused to yield. The city, one of France's finest, suffered bombardment and was slowly encircled. The port's strategic significance had always been secondary to the other bases, but symbolism mattered. The Nazis could not tolerate the image of abandoning French territory. Every port held became a supposed victory, a demonstration of German resolve. In reality, each fortress was a drain on manpower that was desperately needed elsewhere. Divisions that could have been sent to stop the Soviet advance in the east were instead used to garrison these isolated pockets. The mathematical cost of holding Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, La Pallice, and Bordeaux was measured in thousands of soldiers who could have fought on other fronts. But rationality had long since departed from German strategic planning. The U-boat bases were held not because they could